Good evening. I'd like to call to order the virtual study session of the City of Lakewood City Council on April 5th, 2021. There is a public input option for tonight on two of our items, and that number is 1-346-248-7799. Webinar ID is 920-3950. 5230 pound, and then that'll get you in. Then you'll press pound once more to join the meeting, *9 to request to speak, and *6 to unmute. I will now ask for the clerk to please call the roll.
Paul.
Here.
Abel.
Here.
Vincent.
Here.
Gutwein. Beta.
Here.
Skilling.
Here.
Springsteen.
Here.
Franks.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
LeBure.
Here.
Harrison.
Here.
And we have a quorum.
Great. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. Certainly both agenda items are of great interest. The first one that we're about to turn over to Mr. Smith, our Director of Economic Development. It's been something City Council has been talking about for some time. And I know there's been a lot of great public comment through all the different committee meetings. I would also like to acknowledge the Lakewood Speaks comments and thank our clerk and the city team for the new feature of allowing folks to call in and leave a message that then transcribes also. So appreciate all of that. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Smith.
Well, thank you very kindly, Mayor and members of City Council.
Oh, looks like you got muted.
Sorry about that. Must have pushed the button twice or some such thing. My apologies. First of all, thank you very much for making some time on the agenda to talk about this. As the mayor mentioned, I am the Economic Development Director, but tonight I'm here in my capacity as the facilitator for the Housing Policy Commission, which is a subset of council, 6 members involved with that. Talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But part of the reason that we're here tonight is to make certain that the body of the whole, all of council, has access to the information that the Housing Policy Commission has been working on here for quite some time. I refer to the Housing Policy Commission very frequently as the HPC by that acronym. So if I use HPC, that's the acronym that stands for the commission. So without further ado, let me share my screen and I'll run through the elements of the staff memo real quick so folks know what we are referring to.
While you're doing that, Mr. Smith, I'm going to let the record reflect that Councilor Gutwein is with us now. So.
Hang on just a second. Did I lose it?
No, I mean, yeah, we have a line of something.
Can you see that?
Doesn't look like it's a very good document. Seems like we have part of your screen, sir, one side or the other.
Screen sharing is paused. Sorry, I moved from one place to another. My apologies. Let me try that one more time. How's that? A little better?
Yes, sir.
All right. Just wanted to go through all of the reasons and ways that we got here with the Housing Policy Commission, obviously where they've done a lot of research and whatnot. The charge has been to talk about short-term rentals, and sometimes I'll refer to short-term rentals with the initials STR, but short-term rentals are those rentals that are 29 or fewer days, and they've been popularized in many of the last years with the platforms that allow for matching with folks that are looking for short-term rentals. That's the Airbnb and VRBO and those kinds of platforms. And so what it allows for is that folks that have property to be able to match up with folks that want to rent that property for just a few days or up to 29 days of that. And so that's what the HPC has been working on. And that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit this evening and getting some direction from council in that way. So as I mentioned, the two primary purposes for this session is to present to the whole of council a summary of the research because it's very difficult because 6 members of council have had opportunity to really study this and really get a lot of public input. 5 members of council that are serving on other committees haven't yet. So it's very difficult to come in and ask a real, quick question, cold question without a little bit of background. So the idea is to provide that summary of the things that we've been working on and then ask those critical questions for direction at the tail end of that. The second one would be to receive that direction from council in this meeting. And I will let folks that are on the call know that this is not the last of the conversation. This is a study session. So really we're just getting direction tonight. There's no votes being taken. And so if you feel strongly about this issue, you'll want to continue to follow along with the council actions as we move into the future. So quick background, the HPC was created by Ordinance in late 2019, started into the process of working on that short-term rental. COVID hit and moved our schedule around quite a bit, and still we were able to get the elements together and bring it forward at this time. So that's how we got here. Again, we're working with the short-term rentals. There were 6 meetings. All of those meetings had public comment attached with them. I'll characterize the public comment as kind of running the spectrum. There were folks that didn't believe that short-term rentals were appropriate for the city of Lakewood. They felt they changed neighborhoods too dramatically. And then there were folks that really supported the idea of short-term rentals, thought it was an appropriate way to be able to utilize their property for these kinds of activities. So all the way through the spectrum, lots of public input. All of the meetings that we held had opportunity for folks to put those ideas forward, and there will be opportunity to put ideas forward throughout this process as we move ahead with the council here some way. No formal votes were taken with the STR policy elements. The committee, of course, or the commission does do votes on minutes and motions to elect chairs and that sort of thing. But there was no votes taken on any of the elements of the short-term rental. That kind of direction is going to have to come from the whole of council, all 11 members, or as many members as a quorum is here tonight. So want to be able to do that. And there was all kinds of information that was done through what's called the Elicitation Document. We're going to talk a little bit about this as we go through the elements of the Elicitation Document, but it would be entirely appropriate at this point to tip our hats to past Chair Franks, Barb Franks, who was the architect of the Elicitation Document, and it's really what allowed the commission to really dive deep into these issues and really discuss them and really get the information out there, have a lot of public input. And so we're very appreciative to past Chair Franks for all of her work on that particular document, as well as leading the commission there. And then we're also very enthused to have Sharon Vincent as our current chairperson, who's going to lead us in the next leg of this process. And so very excited to have both those people in there, and we can't thank them enough for the efforts that they've put forward so far. Just wanted to mention that there were no formal votes taken again. The commission agreed that if there were short-term rentals to be allowed in Lakewood, they should not be allowed in residential properties that were owned by investors. So in other words, all of the commission agreed that folks that came in and bought houses just for the purposes of doing short-term rentals, that was a no-no. They didn't really want to support that. So most of the suggestions or proposals that we have forward tonight don't allow for that to happen. These are what's often referred to as home sharing, or it's where somebody occupies the dwelling for some percentage of the year, some portion of the year, and the portion of time that they're not there, they potentially rent it out short-term, 29-hour day, fewer days using those platforms. 2 of the commissioners expressed that allowing owner-occupied or home-sharing STRs in Lakewood would not be appropriate for the community. If they had their ability to vote right now, they would vote not to allow STRs to be part of the community. Just so all folks are aware of, this station, STRs are not lawful in the city of Lakewood. Our municipal code doesn't allow for them. It's not very explicit in there. There's no section where you can go to that says STRs aren't allowed, but they aren't explicitly allowed. So that gives our code enforcement and our police force the authority they need to not allow these things to continue to operate. But they are operating in here, and that's part of the reason for this meeting, is to establish what the rules going forward would be. And we'll talk about the 2 directions that we kind of see that going one way or the other. But 2 commissioners didn't think that would be appropriate. 3 of the commissioners did think that it might be appropriate to do home sharing, some kind of home sharing program as long as the guardrails were stiff and sturdy, and that the rules were put into place to protect folks in the community from some of the bad things that might happen in short-term rentals, and that allowed for the short-term rental people to operate their operations successfully and lawfully. So 3 were that way. 2 said we don't think it's appropriate at this time. 1 was not ready to commit until they actually saw what was going to be in that program. They were leaning towards maybe allowing STRs if the guardrails were sturdy enough, but not allowing them if the guardrails were not sturdy enough. So we'll be spending time talking about what those guardrails look like. But understanding that there were 3 commissioners that said that, we want to explore this a little bit further, and 2 that did not, we went ahead with the staff and we used that elicitation document. We're going to talk a little bit more about that shortly, but we used that to formulate kind of a proposed program, or at least the beginning or the genesis of a proposed program. And we'll talk about all of those proposals coming up here shortly. So we did some draft documents, which we're going to go over. We presented those to the Housing Policy Commission at a meeting last month, and they said, yes, let's take them forward to the study session. And that's how we got here today. So having said all of that, we're going to go over 4 documents on here. One is that elicitation document. There are some things that aren't included in there, or there are blanks that are on there. We're hoping that we would get some input from council if council decided to move forward with some kind of short-term rental program. We want to get those blanks filled in, and those who were listed on the memo here. Basically a minimum distance between those short-term rentals. We can do a minimum distance, just like a lot of other businesses that we regulate by distances. Liquor stores aren't allowed to be within certain distances of schools and that sort of thing. We can also regulate short-term rentals with some kind of a distance between them. That's a possibility, but we haven't put down any kind of a measurement because we wanted to get the input from the body of the whole. Minimum number of days that the owner has to live in the house or the property each year, whatever that looks like, or it could be very minimal all the way up to a large number, and only be able to use short-term rental for a portion of that time. And then some level of having additional quiet hours. As these things might unfold into neighborhoods, all of the rules that apply to neighborhoods right now still would apply. So those ordinances and disturbing the peace and all of those sorts of things would be the exact same. But we could also put in a regulation of additional quiet hours. Some folks have concerns when folks come to Lakewood and they want to go skiing. They've rented something on a short-term basis, and they get up very early in the morning and they're opening car doors and they're creating all of that sort of thing, or they check in late at night, or come into the facility or the residence, past midnight, that sort of a thing. So we could put some quiet hours on there as well. We're going to talk a little bit about the flow diagram of where, how we see this kind of stacking up. We've got a draft ordinance that we'll talk about. We've got some folks that participated and created that draft ordinance. It's in your packet. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Then we've got a draft program outline. It's not the program itself. It's not the collateral pieces that we'd use for that program. It basically describes what those pieces would be, or how they would go, and the elements that would be included in them, so that we can take a look at it from kind of that general sort of a feel to it. And if we were to move forward with it, we would be then refining those and coming up with those documents and having those documents in front of council if that's the direction we want to go. I'm going to scroll down here real quick onto the staff report, because there's 3 areas that we're looking to get some level of guidance from council tonight. And guidance means, does the majority of council think we ought to head this direction or that direction, or should we do these kinds of things? And that's what we're really looking for. So the first one is really kind of an either or, and that's the way the staff kind of views it now. We need to do something about short-term rentals. We either need to put them into the code so that they're allowed and can become lawful, or we need to put it into the code explicitly that they're not allowed in the city of Lakewood, and what the elements of that look like. One of those 2 things need to really go into the code to modify it. So we're really looking for an either or decision by the end of the evening, or consensus or direction from council on that issue. 2 others that we're interested in is, if there is a decision to kind of move forward with it, are there more specific direction for those blanks or those elements that we talked about that aren't quite filled in yet from the council, to give us that lead. So if we come back with an additional ordinance or a program, that those elements are covered in what the council would like to see. And then the third one here is, are there amendments or recommendations to what's presented this evening that we should try to incorporate into that as we move forward into into this process. So all of those things are what we're hoping to accomplish. And with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the comprehensive way in which these proposals came forward. So the first one is what we refer to as the Elicitation Document. I assume you can see that on your screen. Can I get a thumbs up from folks? I just changed it off there. Okay, good. Folks can see that. Again, Barb Franks, the architect of this document, and I would argue that Barb knows more about short-term rentals than a lot of other public officials all across the Front Range. She really did a yeoman's job of researching into this, getting information from other communities, really distilling the information down and presenting it in such a way that the commission could talk about all of the elements. So again, the comprehensiveness of this document really owes to Council Member Franks on this. So essentially the first part was kind of the types of short-term rentals, investment properties versus home sharing. I've also already shared with you, the commission didn't think that investment properties were appropriate, but that home sharing in some fashion should be allowed. So there was some thought as to what might be allowed there. This document's available online. People can refer to it. The notes are over on the far side for what commissioners kind of gave a thumbs up to or thumbs down to. And again, don't forget, two commissioners went through this process, and I really want to tip my hat to them, because even though they said, this isn't appropriate, we don't want short-term rentals in Lakewood, or we don't think that's appropriate at this time, they did go through the exercise. They were engaged and participated in all of these elements and offered up things that if we were to incorporate a short-term rental program, what would the guardrails look like? So kudos all around to the folks that went through all of these elements.
Robert?
Yep.
Would it be okay if I just interjected one point for clarity?
Absolutely.
So I wanted to talk just a little bit about the home sharing, the owner occupied one. Wanted to make sure that that our audience was clear that that was kind of further broken down for discussion purposes into how, like Robert had said earlier, whether it's a certain amount of days or months per year that that owner needs to be in that unit. But there was also discussion about whether the owner needs to be present during the rental itself. So I wanted the community and my fellow counselors to be aware that when we're talking about home sharing, that could be when the owner is, say, away, maybe they're visiting Europe for 6 weeks. Can they rent out their place while they're away? Or is it only that they can do that while they're there to supervise the rental activity? So all that's up for discussion. I just wanted to clarify that home sharing can be further subdivided, and be thinking about that as we kind of look at all these materials.
Absolutely. Thank you for that point of clarification. Absolutely a great point. We started the conversation around zoning, and we talked with our friends in planning, and essentially this is a use issue, not so much a zoning issue. In that anywhere that residential might be allowed, these things could potentially operate, as opposed to confining them to certain kinds of zoning. There was some discussion about multifamily units or apartment units being used for short-term rentals. Generally speaking, that's not allowed by the leases that multifamily have, or by mobile home users that might do that as well. And generally speaking, there were some concerns about having those kinds of units be eligible for some level of home sharing along the way there. But essentially, if you're renting property from somebody else, generally speaking, didn't want to re-rent it or sublet it to other folks. It gets a little too far away from the owners, and ownership of these short-term rentals was very important to the commission. So we talked a lot about owner occupied. I'm going to scroll through this document. And again, I won't be going over each and every one of these elements. The idea here is to give some level of summary and then answer questions. So different kinds of structures, generally not available for these kinds of things, property that's owned by the feds or the state, that sort of thing, things that are designated for affordable units, RVs and trailer, generally not eligible for this as proposed right now. Some of the licensing that would need to take place, there need to be a sales tax license and a lodger's tax license on these kinds of properties. Both of those are required for hotels and lodging establishments out here, and so that's why both of those things were incorporated in here. Generally speaking, the commissioners said that if there was an ability to have the taxes be applicable to other kinds of commercial operations, they wanted them to be applicable to short-term rental operations. So they're there. The fee for application, you can see about midway through this section. The goal for that fee is just to have the fee cover the cost of doing the application. It's not to generate revenue for the city. You may hear later on in the revenue discussion or in previous revenue discussions about short-term rentals providing some level of additional revenue to the city. That would be through the collection of those taxes, not through the collection of the fees. The goal was to make the fees applicable to the cost of actually maintaining the program. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Insurance is an important element of this. The commissioners recognize that and realize that you'll need an additional level of insurance on these short-term rentals. Normal house owners policy won't cover the kinds of things that might go catastrophically wrong with these short-term rentals. So you need that additional level, and that's part of the application process, that rider that allows for the house to be used for short-term rental purposes. The duration of the license was generally, I'm sorry, I flipped there real too quick. Duration of the license generally a year, and we'll talk a little bit about maybe the revocation of those licenses and how that would come about. You can see right on there that there was some concern about the determination immediately upon major violations. We haven't completely defined what major violations are. You can imagine on the one extreme some very major violations, but some other violations may not be major enough to talk about the revocation of the license. So we'd have to more strongly define that. And then safety there, the bottom one there, allow the applicant to perform their own safety inspections. The commissioners didn't believe that would be a good idea. They really wanted a third party to do that. For hotels, the city actually has building inspectors. The police force goes out and does inspections, and the fire department does inspections. It's very costly and very time consuming. And so one of the things that we talked about as part of the program is to maybe have a third party, like a home inspection company, kinds of folks that do home inspections for houses when you buy and sell houses, may be able to perform that under the guide of whatever the city wants to make certain is in that program. So you could not only have mechanical safety and positions of egress and ingress to the property and all of those kinds of things. You could also include that they need to have fire extinguishers and some other things that make that would be appropriate for these sorts of things. That third party could inspect them, and then that certificate of inspection could become part of the process. So safety requirements, we just touched a little bit on that they're based on the local code. Nothing that would be difficult for folks, and to do kind of a heightened level of being able to work with the property. We talked a lot about community notification, or good neighbor program, and I think that title was one that the Colorado Springs folks use for their program down there. But essentially, it's to be a good neighbor. It's to let folks know that you're applying for this kind of license, that you're going to be running a short-term rental in the neighborhood, and folks know how to get a hold of you, and they understand that folks are in there, and that you have done all of the things that you need to do to get that license, and that you're maintaining that license in good stead. So all of those things are part of this process. We'll talk a little bit about the fact that it's kind of a two-part process, and in between those two parts is when you would do a lot of that good neighbor notification for that. Talked a lot about some of the other things of requirement on there, ongoing education and updates for folks that are doing these STRs. Commissioners were very much in favor of that, so that would be incumbent upon the staff to make certain that the education program is going forward, how to maintain that good neighbor status, how to be helpful in your neighborhood, helpful in your community. The city maintained map of the licenses, the STRs. Obviously, we want to keep that in place so that we know where they are, and if there's some kind of a distance requirement between them, that would allow us to also map out that and be able to say, okay, this one is closer, further away from the other ones, that sort of a thing. Whether that's put on online or used or available to the public, that's somewhat up in the air. Most of the commissioners thought that would be a good idea to do that. A lot of the rental platforms have gone to the point of not necessarily putting out addresses and whatnot until they can secure rentals on there. So the goal here, and the safety folks talked a lot about this, is that if you identify a house as a short-term rental house and people are nefarious folks are casing the neighborhood, if you've got something that clearly indicates that this is a short-term rental home, that might invite problematic behavior out of folks, as opposed to it looks like a house in the neighborhood. The neighbors know it, the city knows it, the licensed folks know it, but that we're not really advertising that well out there. That was something that came up in those conversations. The application, form would have all of the things that you would anticipate that they would have on there, with additional things. And when we get to the program outline, we'll talk about what those things are. To reiterate once again, after we got the opinions of the commissioners on this solicitation form, we took this to the staff and talked a lot about how do we implement this just as the council has outlined it. So with every element that's on this solicitation form, we tried to bake into the proposed program. So you'll see that, hopefully, that translation between this solicitation document and those proposed documents as well. So the compliance and the enforcement and the taxes, we talked a lot about those things. How do you do complaints, and how does that go in there? And we'll talk more about that as we head to those other documents. Those were all very much on the top of mind for the commissioners. They want to make sure that whatever we proposed had those elements baked into it. And so the taxes, generally speaking, as I said, lodging tax, sales tax, those sorts of things, all part of that program. Budgetary and staff implications, we're still working our way through that as the staff. We know that there may be, potentially up to hundreds of these things out in the area there. As I mentioned, they're unlawfully operating at this point, but we do know that some are operating out there. Don't know how many of them. If all, let's say that just for the sake of argument, there were 300 of them and all 300 of them applied on a Monday, that would put an incredible burden on our staff in terms of trying to process those applications and get them moving in the right direction and whatnot. So we may have to ramp up staffing and that sort of thing, and we want to make certain that the program is able to pay for those costs to be able to handle those things so that we can expediently get that going. We all believe that once the program is up and operating, if there's a lot of these kinds of things in the city and a lot of folks are operating on there, that maintaining the program would be easier than that ramp up or get going on there. And so the staff was asked to provide some information about what they thought might be needed in the program. And so we've included that in that draft program. So there was additional restriction and questions on there. Should there be occupancy limits, in addition to what the house might be able to handle? And the answer was generally yes. And so those kinds of things can be, if the short-term rental has 3 bedrooms, then there can only be 2 people per bedroom. So 6 people is the max on that particular hypothetical example. But that was the goal, was to try to make sure that they were listed and they figured out what those occupancies would be. Should there be certain lengths of stay? Should they be, maximums and minimums? Generally speaking, there was some thought that, probably, obviously 29 or fewer is the upper limit, but maybe there should be a requirement of a couple of days or that sort of a thing. There was discussion about that. Feet to separate, once again on there. And that brings us to the end of this solicitation document. So the commissioners all put their input in there. We took all that information in. We took it to the staff, and I'd like to say thank you to the staff that worked on these draft documents I'm about to go through. I'll give a quick shout out to our friends in the city clerk's office, Bruce Rome and Jessica Clausen helped out with this process. Planning department, Travis Parker, Christy Ivanoff, and Matt Post. Christy Ivanoff did a lot of the work on the ordinance you're about to take a look there. Lakewood PD and code enforcement, Dan McCaskey, Chief Dan, and Gail Spencer, both very much involved in this process in terms of being able to enforce these kinds of things. The city's attorney's office, Greg Graham, Warren Stanek, were both involved in this, as well as our new city attorney, Allison McKinney Brown. Finance, the CFO, Holly Bjorklund, was involved in this process, as was Aaron Nordman and Nicole Stair, all inputting into this so that we're there. And of course, our fearless leader, Kathy Hodson, making certain that we stay on track and make sure we get all of that information in the right place at the right time. And just want to make sure I tip my hat to all of those folks because they participated in all of these documents. Here's the flow chart that I've been referring to a couple of times, and this is the basic way the plan comes together. You start with that blue box, number 1. The applicant submits the complete applicants with all of the attachments that need to happen on that first time, pays the application fee to the city clerk's office. That's who would be administering these licenses, is the city clerk's office. You head down to the next box there, number 2, the orange box, and the CCO completes the initial application check. So in other words, they're looking for completeness, proximity, all of the basic qualifications are met for that first round of the application. And if all of those things are met, they'll give a written go-ahead that says, hey, you need to move on to the next phase of this because there's a second phase of the application process in the black box, but you've got to do the the third step here, or that green box in there, where you perform all the neighborhood notifications and you reach out to your neighbors and say, hey, we're working on this short-term rental application. You do the inspections, you make sure that you've got all the necessary documents so that you can turn all of those in for that box number 4, which is the whole shebang. That's the final application. All of the elements are in there. You either have everything and they're adequate, and then it makes sense to issue the license, or you don't have all of those things and they're not adequate for issuing that license. And then the CCO would refer that out to corrections. If it's correctable, you need to correct it. If for whatever reason you can't correct it, we can't issue the license. If the license is issued, it's valid for 1 year, and then the license address is added to the map or the table that covers all of those. The ordinance got separated when I went out here for just a moment, so I'll come back to the ordinance. It's in your packet, but it's a draft ordinance. And as I mentioned, the planning crew did a great job in terms of refining that out. I'm going to talk a little bit about this rough program outline now, which is all of the elements that were in the elicitation document taken one step further. Just so everyone's aware, rather than do a complete program that may or may not be needed at this point, because council, the body of the whole, may say, hey, we don't think short-term rentals are appropriate, and then we would have done a lot of work and spent a lot of time and energy getting something refined that wouldn't be there. We got it to this point so that you could really get a sense of what would we do if we went forward on here. So short-term rental license, 1 year in length, can be renewed automatically. There's an initial fee review after 6 months to make sure that the fees are appropriate to the work that we're doing there. You have it for that 1 year in length if you're in good standing, and then you're able to do something in subsequent years. We didn't put a number in there, and the staff will have to do that if we refine that and get that down to what we think is our best thing, because again, the goal is to cover the cost. We did put in this document just the fact that the license is $750 as an initial application fee, and each renewal is $400. We're not trying to necessarily set the price. We're not saying that that's where it's at. That's just one element. That's one data point that's on these kinds of applications. And then we'd reassess that STR licensing fee annually to make certain that we're covering our costs. The collateral materials that we produce, this is a copy of the STR code. So we have that code, so we can hand you that part of the code at any time. We can mail you that part of the code at any time. So folks would know exactly what's codified in the ordinance for short-term rentals. There'd be an informational brochure with program information. I like to call this so you'd like to do a short-term rental brochure. That's what we'd be putting forward there, and it outlines most of the elements of the program and what needs to happen there. You'd have that flow chart, a little more sophisticated than what I just showed you there, but essentially, how do you go through that application process? What does that process look like, and what's the outcome on the other side? There'd also be some causes for why the STR license might be revoked, and the process for handling complaints would be a document that everyone would be able to have access to, particularly the folks that are doing these short-term rentals. And then all of the elements of the Good Neighbor program, the distance notification requirements, any draft letters or form letter types of things that need to be sent out to folks. We want to make sure they're there, that there's a sample placard. There's an idea that there needs to be a placard in each of these units, and the placard has things like the maximum occupancy, where is the parking allowed, and where what's the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week number, so you can get a hold of the owner at any given time so that you can resolve complaints. All of that's on a placard that's prominently displayed in the unit. A list of the safety inspection elements, that document that might go to the house inspection company so that you can get that done. Ongoing education materials, all of that would be collateral materials that we would need to produce as part of this program if it were to move forward as we kind of outlined here. The application, all of the general information on there. The homeowner would have to have some level of acceptance of the contact information as being valid 24/7. That's one of those things where if something's going wrong with the house, we want to be able to get a hold of the owner, and we want to be able to do that quickly. So they would acknowledge that. The acceptance of the required notifications of changes in 72 hours. Because the license would be with the property and the owner, would kind of work with both of those. If you sold your house and you had an STR license, you want to notify the system that you no longer own that house. That license would then come back out. And if the new owners wanted to do a new license, they would have to go through that whole process again to make certain that it's there. But any changes like that, you got to let the city know within 72 hours. Acceptance of the program rules and requirements. Here they all are. You sign off that says, hey, I understand the rules and and I'm going to be following those rules. And then a signature of all the people that are on the title of the house. If it's one person that's entitled, that's great. But if there's 3 people, all 3 people need to be able to sign that application and make sure that we've got it there. We need certification from the insurance carrier. In the first round, it could be as simple as just your current homeowner insurance company says, if this were to get licensed, yes, we can get you that additional level of coverage that you need to be. So as you go through that process, you can get that done. In the final, you have to have that certification. You can't be issued that license after the final without that. So because there's 2 steps, it allows for folks that are pursuing this license to have a 2-step sort of an effect here. The initial document is the map showing designated parking spaces. One of the concerns that came up a lot was parking in the neighborhoods, parking on public streets. Any of these would need to have off-street parking, at least that 1 spot, maybe 2, depending on how the program comes in there. But that folks that are short-term renting the house have a place to park that's off the street, on the driveway, in the garage, somewhere, so that it's not necessarily an imposition on the neighbors for folks that are guests in the house. And you would have to show a map that says this is where the parking is going to happen as part of the application. There'd also be that map showing the distances between other short-term rentals and being able to identify where those are in relationship to that. You need a copy of the county title document to make sure that the people that are on the title are the folks making the application. And then you'd have to have that signed safety inspection report. You get it from that third party, but it says that the mechanical is great and that there are the smoke and carbon monoxide detectors are working the way they're supposed to. And if you need fire extinguishers, that the fire extinguishers are there and available and that sort of thing. In the final document, the certification of all the good neighbor notification elements that have been satisfied needs to be there. In other words, we notified the neighbors, we sent letters out there, we talked to folks, we made sure that the placards are in there, we went through the education program, we did all of those things so that we know how to be good neighbors and that our neighbors know what we're working on here. Some of the requirements there are the home sharing owner. There's no investor properties, as I mentioned, as the commission outlined their recommendation. The homeowner must be, home must be owner occupied. There's a certain number of days or percentage of the year when they're there, that sort of thing. And as Councilmember Franks pointed out, there could also be that notice of could they be away, could they be there, that sort of thing could be incorporated. The home must have been owned by the applicant on the title for some minimum amount of time. And we've left that blank in there because, do they have to own the home for a year before they can start short-term rentaling? Or is it some other length of time that's on there? That's also a hedge against those investors buying properties and using them for this purpose only. You have to get that sales and use tax license. That happens online. So that's kind of a separate process. You get that through online. You'd have to have that lodging tax license as well. That also happens online. You have to have the commercial liability insurance, as you mentioned. Annual safety inspection by professionals. So that would happen once a year along there. And this third person authorized by that document that shows all the things that we're looking for, all the basic requirements are there. If there was any kind of a safety complaint or there was some kind of a problem with the safety of the unit and whatnot, the license could be temporarily suspended while that gets corrected. If it gets corrected, then it needs to be re-inspected, was the recommendation from the HPC. If there are multiple owners, they all need to be represented on the application once again. The license could be revoked immediately upon any major violation. As I said, we haven't really defined what those majors and what those minors might be, but that could certainly be something the council could define, and we would put that into the program. The requirements of the placard, as I mentioned, it's on site, prominently displayed. It's got the STR license number on there. So when you get through this process, you would get a license number. That's got to be on that placard so that if there's a problem, we know exactly who's the licensee there. 24 hours, 7 days a week, owner contact information is on the placard. Something goes wrong, this is who you can call. The house STR occupancy limits also listed on that card. And then the parking requirements. You're supposed to be parked here. If you're not parked here, go get your car and put it in the right spot so that you're not in the wrong spot. The process timeline, we talked a little bit about that with the flow chart, but it's the 2-phase sort of approach. You've got that initial, then you've got that good neighbor program, that outreach program, that safety inspection, and then you come back for that final level of the inspection. The staff Staffing, we talked, as I mentioned, about this. We think that there might be some harder numbers ramping up the program than what might be sustainable. But the city clerk estimated that may require 20 hours of staff time in order to maintain these kinds of things, or we would need an outside vendor to offset that. The staff team did do a consultation with one of the commercial folks that do this kind of management of STRs to find out what they could and couldn't do. What we determined is there's no turnkey program that handles everything that we would want it to handle. In other words, we can't turn it over to somebody else and not have any staff time on this. Staff would have to be involved with the program at some point. We may be able to offset it with a company that can help us do certain parts of that process, but we can't just offload it to somebody that would take care of everything that we need. The IT and GIS folks estimated that they might need 5 hours of staff time in order to maintain the map and make sure that the data is up to date, and if things change or move, that we maintain that map in there. Code enforcement, the police folks just indicated that may require additional time to work with the licensees. Obviously, the licensees wouldn't be paying necessarily for folks who don't get licensed. The police and the code enforcement people need to work with those folks, but there should be a recognition that that does put some level of effort into the police and code enforcement people in order to maintain these things, just to take care of the folks that are doing it the right way and making sure that they're there. The approval authority of the city clerk would be issuing these licenses. They have the power of revocation upon the recommendation of code enforcement, the Lakewood police folks, and other city departments along the way. Would outline that very carefully, but would make sure that folks knew that, and that they know what the due process sort of a thing is. How can you reinstate that license if you wanted to? How do you make sure that you have an opportunity to talk about whatever went wrong and the role that was in there and whether that license was there? Those due process things would be outlined, but the city clerk would be essentially the ones that are maintaining that the license is in good stead. Complaints and enforcement, the neighbors have access to the host contact information, so they can theoretically contact the host at any time and say, hey, something's going wrong with the house over there. We want you to be aware of that and want you to do some level of resolution on there. They can also complain into the city through any of the written sorts of things, through email, through writing, through Request Lakewood. All of those would be handled by the appropriate city departments and divisions that would go out there. So if a complaint came in that said, hey, the STR down the block was doing X, Y, and Z, then we would send out the appropriate folks to work with that and determine what the best form of resolution is. If there were anything that required emergency services, obviously they would incorporate emergency services. So if there's something catastrophically going wrong with the STR down the street, that they would call the appropriate folks and say, hey, we need the police to come out here and investigate. We need the fire department to come out because there's some kind of a wrongness going on here. So those kinds of things would be allowed for the complaints driven sorts of things. And then the STR license could be revoked as if there were frequent complaints or unresolved complaints, or those complaints were major enough to cause that. We also wanted to add one other thing on here, and the commission talked about this, thought it would be a good idea, and that's to license or certify the platforms, the technical platforms. So the Airbnb, the VBROs of the world, those folks, and say, hey, if you're going to list properties in Lakewood, here's the minimum things that you have to do. Those listings have to include a license. So if you're listing folks that haven't gone through the license process, you're culpable for that. We don't want that to happen. Some other cities have worked with these kinds of things with limited amounts of success or some level of success. We would like to be able to do that too, to make certain that that the Airbnb doesn't say, hey, that's not my concern along the way. That you're facilitating this, you're making this happen or allowing this to happen. We want you to be at least partially responsible. And here's the requirements for licensure in our city. And we don't want you advertising or listing for folks that haven't gone through that process. So having said all of those along the way here, somehow I managed to lose my ordinance on here. I'm going to see if I can find it real quick. I'm sorry, I don't know what I did with it. I can find it here in just a second. We can go through the levels of the ordinance to be able to see what's on there. It has traditional ordinance language. It outlines all of the things that are on there, but we have those blanks still in there, distances and that sort of thing in the ordinance. If council were to decide that we want to move forward with that, we would start with that ordinance as the foundation. So if you don't mind, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to turn it back to you. I'm going to see if I can find the ordinance because somehow technically it's on one of these screens and I can't quite see it at the moment. If I see it, I can run through it real quick, but at this point, I'll turn it back to you. That's essentially our presentation other than that ordinance document.
Nicely done. I think for the next few minutes, at least, let's take the presentation down for the questions section, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, I just wanted to go over a couple of things. Again, want to thank Ms. Franks for all of her hard work as the chair in really putting this together. And also the members, which consisted of Ms. Johnson and Ms. Vincent from Ward 2, who's now the chair. Mr. Beta was on the commission, and now Ms. Springsteen is on the commission. Ward 4, of course, Ms. Franks, and Ward 5, Ms. Harrison. So what I would like to do is I'd like to go through and have you ask a couple of questions on this proposal or what you just saw. Then I'd like to do a quick check-in and see if we're at least to a point of do we want to continue going forward or not. And then I want to, based upon that, go to the community input because we certainly have a lot of interest from the community. So with that, we'll do some rounds of questions and then I'll do a check-in and see which way we want to go. We'll hear from the community, then we can come back based on that and continue. So, Mr. Abel, you are first.
Thank you, and I have more than a couple of questions, but if we're going to have more than one round, that's fine. I'll start with a couple. Is that the case? Okay.
Yes, sir. Unless nobody else has questions, then.
Well, then I'll just keep going. A couple of general things. Firstly, we talk about home sharing. There is a new practice out there in the zoning world, also known as home sharing, whereby a residence is divided up according to bedrooms and bathrooms, and each individual that lives there either holds a lease to or owns a bedroom and a bathroom, and the communal areas are held together. So I would like to make sure that we define home sharing in our terms in the definition table, so that the two, we're talking home sharing as in short-term rentals. And the other practice is much different. So let's just define home sharing. Secondly, according to our zone ordinance, you can have a home business in Lakewood, but it is one of two types: a minor home business or a major home business. The kind of traffic, parking, and other monitoring and licensing would make this seem to be a major home business, which has certain rules that answer a lot of the questions here, especially distance, because a major home business can only be located on the corner of two arterial streets, I believe, or two collector streets. So first we need to decide whether these are minor or major home businesses. Also, a major home business requires a special use permit. So those are my first two.
Okay.
Can we define home sharing to fit our purposes? And where do we come down on the home businesses, major or minor?
Okay, thank you. Mr. Smith, do you want to quarterback those two?
Yes, I would defer to some folks in our planning operation in terms of whether they're major or minor. I think that was taken under consideration, but I don't know the answer myself off the top of my head there. And then defining home sharing is done within the ordinance. There is a section of home sharing defined with regard to short-term rentals.
It's not in the definitions.
Okay.
The term home sharing is not in the definitions.
Well, and I think Ms. Franks elaborated a little bit that may be some more direction that this council needs to give as far as that home share
Oh,
goes.
sure, that's fine.
While we're looking at, looks like Robert's looking at that, do we have an answer to the minor versus major, or some input on that?
I'd ask our city attorney and maybe someone on her staff. Is Allison, is that something that you can help define?
I have not been a participant in the short-term rental discussion, and Greg Graham is on the line because he's participated in that. One thing I'm wanting everybody to remember is that licensing and zoning are two different processes. So STRs might be prohibited within a certain zone. For example, no STRs within industrial zones. And that can be, but the rules about STRs are a licensing process. So keep the two separate. Zoning and licensing are two separate processes. And no, licensing may not supersede zoning. So those, as we hear the input from council tonight regarding some of these issues, we'll go back into the draft ordinance and make sure these issues are clarified. So with those just general thoughts, I'm going to mute myself and let Greg answer any questions that he may be prepared to answer on this topic.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Graham, if you want to try to tackle those two.
And are you talking about Mr. Abel's questions, specific questions?
Yes, sir.
I honestly don't have a good answer regarding the use question, the major home business versus a minor home business. I do know that when we first discussed policing and enforcing regarding short-term rentals, one thing I thought of was, is this a home business? Is it allowed? Is it not allowed? My understanding from planning was they didn't view it as an in-home business because it didn't fit the categories that are established for in-home businesses. So it'd be sort of a separate kind of a thing. We've had some discussions off and on about that, but it's probably best. It would be best to, and I think planning was thinking that we could get away with not making changes to the zoning ordinance. But I think we might need to revisit that with them, have that conversation with them, and then get back to you on that. So that's the in-home business question. I'm sorry, I forgot what the other question was, Mr. Abel. You're muted, sir.
Yeah, you're muted, Mr. Abel.
There we go. I can't wait till we get back live. The other was simply just to add our definition of home sharing in the definition section, so someone won't come back later and refer to the body of verbiage about home sharing, which really doesn't spell it out.
Yes, and that is absolutely something we can do. We can add that. I had not heard of that type of thing before. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that could certainly become an issue. So we can add that. That wouldn't be a problem. And, based on what council directs staff to do this evening, work that definition in a way that chances are would prohibit that kind of a short-term rental in that type of situation. But absolutely.
Yeah, I would echo that. Councilmember Abel, you're correct. The home sharing is not in the ordinance. I thought it was. We spent a good deal of time talking about it, but we would incorporate that definition. It is not there in the current draft. You're right.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Franks had a quick follow-up, and then Ms. Springsteen.
Thanks, Mayor Paul. I did want to talk a little bit just about the definition. The reason why we didn't put that in there is because we didn't have the direction from council on what they were going to kind of codify that as being. Also, it's important to note that we do need to have something very defined, because as this is a area that is continuing to evolve, you now have commercial companies who are contacting, as part of their business model, homeowners offering to renovate part of their house to make it more appealing and entering into contractual arrangements for the renovations for a revenue sharing. So it turns it almost like into a B&B type situation where the owner lives there, but they're in a contractual relationship with somebody who shares the profits, which then turns it into an investor type of an occupation. So again, lots of permutations here. I also did want to talk about the research that I've done on the major versus minor. Doesn't mean the research is all inclusive, but many of the municipalities came down on the side of minor, being more that it's an accessory use when it's a homeowner. And even though outdoor spaces, meaning the people are using the patios and such, that didn't cross over. Now, that doesn't mean that's where we have to land, but I did want folks to know that that was an area of research, and the accessory use, but knowing that the people renting may use outdoor spaces for, obviously recreating. But I think it's certainly worth a legal exploration from our team. And that's all I had to add.
Thank you. All right, Ms. Springsteen.
Well, I just wanted to weigh in because I've been involved in working with counselors in the county of Denver on this same issue, as well as representing people on this issue in the county of Denver. And so I know how really, really complicated this can get, especially in an enforcement sort of category. And so one of the things I wanted to bring up is what we're talking about tonight is, are we going to vote on whether these are allowed or not allowed? And I wonder if there's a third option, which might be we leave things as is. And I don't know if that's an option, but Councilor Bita had brought up that perhaps this isn't something that we should be deciding on, but that the voters should be deciding on. And I have to say that's an interesting idea, because I think this is such a complicated issue and people have such a variety of opinions on this. We have seen so many messages on both sides of the issue that it's a really difficult thing to vote on behalf of our constituents. And so I'd kind of like to ask about that and whether that's an option. But just as far as a question with regard to enforcement, what I have seen in the city of Denver is that they have a whole section under excise and licensing with several employees who are involved in enforcement, and they have actually crossed over into the realm of prosecuting people criminally. And so that's a whole different set of expenses. And so I guess one of my questions is, if you really look at, and then you have the issue of appeals. So if people don't like that their license has been taken away or not renewed, what's the appellate process? And so I guess one of my biggest questions is how do we really know what the expense to our city is going to be in terms of enforcement, and is it something we can afford? So those are my beginning questions. Thanks.
Right, thank you. So I'll start with one of the questions. Certainly council can refer anything to the ballot as far as an ordinance goes. The goal tonight is to get some sort of temperature from council. We have been dealing with this, and I know folks are going to fall all over the place and it can be quite complicated, but to really get to some sort of point of yes or no. But if council chooses to go a different way, that's certainly up to the folks here. I think one of the issues we are faced with is, as in the presentation, they're operating everywhere, and we don't have anything really that either allows us to fully enforce them not being able or allowing them to be able. So we're in this weird gray area, and I think that kind of direction would probably help out the city a lot. So the true costs question, Mr. Smith, or I don't know who wants to kind of tackle that, or if we can get to a true cost.
Well, the discussion has been that we would need to at least assert something at the beginning that we think will be adequate for covering the cost of the program. Obviously, if they balloon up or there's changes, and as Councilmember Springsteen pointed out, the city of Denver started with one assumption and they've moved into other areas, and now they're in a whole new ball game over there. That may happen with the city of Lakewood as well. We would that's why we have that kind of monitoring it every 6 months and saying, is this adequate to handle the efforts of this program? And that's essentially the best answer that I give you at this moment, is that we would do our best to cost estimate correctly to begin with, but that as it went on, if there needs to be additional sorts of things, we would have to add those on and figure out ways to handle.
All right, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you. Someone brought it up. It might have been Anita, that we really should have a vote up or down if we even want to have short-term rentals in Lakewood. Number one. Number two, in my reading on different things, the issue came up regarding the owner being a natural citizen. Has that ever been discussed? I don't recall that in our housing committee. It's certainly.
Can you show us where that's at?
I don't have it right offhand, Adam.
Mr. Smith, are you familiar with that section?
Not familiar with that, with other folks doing it. Councilmember Johnson's right in that it wasn't particularly discussed in the Housing Policy Commission meetings along the way. Many of the applications that are on here, because they involve taxation and whatnot, require some level of I forget the exact term that the IRS uses, but basically it's folks that are able to be taxed and that sort of thing. So if there is Councilmember Johnson used naturalized citizen, but I think what she's getting to is the folks, are they able to operate a business because they're citizens in the country successfully on here? And forgive me if I'm getting it wrong, ma'am, but I think that's what you're asking. And generally speaking, most of the taxation sorts of things require an entity. And maybe Mr. Graham can remind me of what the term is, but it's a I can't remember the exact term, but essentially someone that can do that. We went through this on the grants program, the business grants program. We talked a little bit about the folks that could apply for business grants versus folks that couldn't. So, Greg, do you recall that terminology?
Yeah, it's verification of lawful presence. So to receive a public benefit, you have to verify that you're lawfully present in the United States. And there are dozens, literally dozens of ways to do that. But we usually take a driver's license or a state issued ID or something like that. And this being issued a license for an STR in Lakewood or anywhere else would be considered a public benefit. And so anyone applying would have to provide proof that they're legally in the country and that they're entitled to the public benefit.
I guess I'm just familiar with Europeans that are buying businesses in the US, and that's kind of where I was also concerned, really. I'm aware of that. It is going to be hard to know if a guest is in the house under 30 days or under 29 days. How do we feel that we have the ability to watch that?
Well, the general answer to that question is that once you've got the licensure, you would also be you would need to be able to be audited, essentially. So checking in on terms of who's coming, who's going, how those things are happening, that would be the ability to do that. Whether folks are in there for more than 29 days, short-term rental program is designed for those things that that are under that. So if that were the violation, that certainly would be a violation of the short-term rental licensing arrangement. That would be a long-term rental, and those are handled in a different way.
It seems to me that without having the placard or the sign outside for all of the residents in the neighborhood to see clearly what the occupancy should be, what the parking parameters are, who the 24/7 contact person is, that we actually are putting the neighbors in the position of, for lack of a better word, babysitting this property, see if they're staying in compliance. I don't know how you can tell if somebody's over 30 days. I don't know. I think that's something that we at least need to be aware of, that's out there. And I don't recall in the committee if we were ever given any numbers, another question, regarding complaints from the police department, any hard data, them going out to any of the short-term rentals that are currently illegal, what kind of complaints they had, and how that was handled, particularly if this was an illegal operation in a home. How many were there? Were there many to one particular residence? Do we have any data like that?
Yes, I think Ms. Franks had that provided, and I'm not sure if it went through 2019 or into 2020, but I know that I had asked the same question and Ms. Franks provided that. So I think that's something that we could. I was surprised that it was pretty small, but I think that also has to do with the fact we don't necessarily know who's doing it and who's not, right? We kind of have a blurred map, so.
And it's complaint driven too, which, it takes a certain level of frustration for people to actually call in. I think that there is one thing that we can't ignore is that Lakewood does have recreational marijuana, and hotels obviously are not allowing their guests to use those as their place to stay. People do come to our state because of that reality. Neighbors are going to be smelling the odor. That also needs to be part of one of the pieces on what can be complained about. In addition to noise, it would be odors coming from the house. That's all for now. I actually have many thoughts on this, but right now, no questions.
Yeah, and like I said, everybody's going to have thoughts. So let's try to get our questions answered and see if we can get to some sort of direction, and then also get the community to weigh in. So I have Ms. Harrison, I have Mr. Beta, and then that's all that I have. And then we can go to our second round. I have Ms. Springsteen and Mr. Abel again. So Ms. Harrison.
Thank you. In the process of any kind of complaints, even now, I think normally code enforcement would be called in. I'm just saying any kind of neighborhood complaint first. And then code enforcement would do the research and decide what needs to be done and what doesn't. Would that still be handled that same way? I'm remembering us discussing this. Would the code enforcement be the department that'll do the complaint-driven investigation? Because I know the city clerk's office doesn't have somebody to do that, but that's what's going to generate the control from the neighborhood, I believe, is that investigation. Is what you remember, Barb, or whomever's going to answer that question?
Well, I guess I'll maybe take a short stab. It really depends on the nature of the complaint. Obviously, depending on level of severity, we may have to dispatch police or fire or other types of folks. But if you're talking about maybe a noise complaint or parking or that type of thing, my understanding is yes, that it would continue to be code enforcement. I've heard nothing differently. So I'm looking and seeing Kathy nodding her head. So yes, it would be that same process that would be utilized. But certainly we're wanting, if we do move forward with this, that the renters would be able to have access to knowing who to call for fire, who to call for emergency, making sure 911, so the appropriate folks could be reached. So I think it varies based on the severity, but no changes to the underlying what happens today. If you report a short-term rental, it goes to code enforcement because it's not a legal activity, so it goes to them presently.
That's what I thought. And then the other question would be, in the good neighbor notification, we didn't put a specific distance, did we? The way in zoning changes, there's, certain neighborhood. I remember us discussing it, but I don't remember a distance. So would it need to be 100 feet, 500 feet? What would it need to be for that notification?
Well, and I'm going to jump in here real quick. I think that we purposely left some of this to see where council was going. I mean, if council says that they have no appetite for this and they say no, but there'll be blanks to be filled in. And I'm sure that as staff works through to create those materials, there certainly can follow what was done in, Colorado Springs, if that's council's direction, or we can have a fill in the blank like Robert had done with earlier things. But I think the real crux is when you look at it overarchingly, when you represent your community, are you generally in favor or not? So we kind of give staff the right kind of direction as far as them moving forward. There'll be lots of details that have to be worked out depending on which direction we give to staff.
Okay.
Ms. Hoffman, I think did you want to weigh in? Was your hand? I couldn't tell. Okay. Sorry, Ms. Harrison.
That's okay. I guess the good neighbor letter is really important to me simply for the fact that that's how we're going to get the word out to the neighborhoods if we decide that this is something that we want to do that, so that all the neighbors know who to call, what numbers, et cetera, because I'm assuming that information would need to be included in that good neighbor contact letter that goes out so that we can have some good contact information. So thank you. That's the end of my question. I do have comments, but we'll do that later. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so I'm trying to keep track of those who haven't gone. So I have Mr. Beta, then I have Miss Gutwein, and then Miss Springsteen, Mr. Abel, Miss Johnson. So Mr. Beta, go ahead.
Thank you. I had asked Mr. Smith earlier a couple of questions, so I know he'll know these now pretty easily, but I wanted to share this information with the rest of council and also with the community as well. So I'll kind of ask them in a leading fashion just to move it along, Mr. Smith. So the first question I had was, as I understand it, we estimate that there are roughly 300 short-term rentals operating in Lakewood at this point, understanding that that's somewhat of a guess. Is that a fair statement?
The short answer is we don't know, but there's been speculation that there may be as many as that in the area, and so we've been using that as kind of a number to work through that 300 number. But it's hard to tell at this point, how many there are. But that's the number that we've been kind of working with.
Okay, and then my second question is, as I understand it, there are approximately 70,000 households within the city of Lakewood. Is that correct?
Yeah, those are dwelling units, and we use the dwelling units as the measure for the allocation process. That's the number that we start with. There's a very specific number that's 69, something along, but it's roughly 70,000 dwelling units on there. Of those, I don't know if you want to ask me another question before I answer what you asked me before, but essentially of those, many of those would be multifamily, which wouldn't be eligible for, this home sharing sort of an arrangement. Excuse me. I don't know the answer to how many of them might be eligible to do this short-term rental. The distance requirement would create that would have an effect on the number. So if there was one that was every so many feet, in the neighborhood, depending on how large that was, that would reduce down the number of folks that would be eligible for this STR. And I don't have a very specific number for that. I'm sorry, I don't have a better estimate, but that's where we're at.
Yeah, but that's okay. But I think the numbers to start with is there's, roughly 70,000 units, and then certainly some portion of that would be eligible and feasible for short-term rentals. Yes. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beta. Ms. Gutwin.
Thank you. First question is just, I wanted to understand kind of the thinking about the potential prohibition on multifamily. So if someone from the committee maybe could kind of share, I just want to understand kind of what the thoughts are on that.
Franks, do you want to talk about that? I think it more or less coincides with the multifamily restrictions on them imposed by their it's not an HOA, but by the management company.
Yes, that was the general, when you're looking kind of across those swaths, is that there are leasing arrangements and other things that preclude that. And so you'll find that many municipalities, exclude them from there. Of course, an HOA, regardless of what housing stock it is, the HOA rules would be the ones that overrode anything that we were to do. So if we were to say that's fine in a single family house, but yet you had an HOA that had covenants on top of that, so that could be prohibited through those HOA covenants. But that was the direction that we went, was excluding them. Also, you have the closer proximity, which then, with this type of additional foot traffic in higher traffic areas to begin with, puts pressure on all of the infrastructure, and many municipalities looked at it from that standpoint to say, if it's already multifamily and then we have this additional traffic moving, that can cause safety concerns for roads and things that weren't built for that. So again, there's a lot of different ways. There's 1,000 ways communities have done this, and 1,000 ways that we could look to do it as well.
Thank you. Okay, so basically, some of them already have regulations prohibiting this, is kind of the big piece. Okay. Okay, and then my next question is just, from our original conversation in this, I recall that, one of the challenges we have is just if we do have a ban, or, if they're not allowed, just keeping track of where they are, what's happening, and there's not really a good process for this. And I think there was some kind of third-party tracking system that we can hire. Is there an update on that, or what would that look like?
Do we want me to go again?
If you feel comfortable, please.
Yes. There are companies that use very specific data metrics in order to be able to ascertain that. Obviously now, with many municipalities requiring that the platforms produce a licensing number, it helps with then finding the ones that are not in compliance. But they have data sources where they are able to locate the residents without having an address through a variety of publicly available data sources. And those companies are out there. They have, there's gone through a lot of acquisitions. So there's been a lot of, there were more companies, and now they're being centralized into fewer and fewer. But again, depending on where council goes, city staff can look to see what needs to be done, and do we have the staff to do that, or where they may need to look for an outsourcing opportunity.
Okay, that's helpful. So then that also sounds like there's been improvements on the licensing process as well, and making sure that folks are getting the necessary license and that we can actually track that. So that's good. All right, well, those are my questions. I certainly have comments, and then also just wanted to thank our resident short-term rental expert, Counselor Franks, for all of the work that you've done, but everyone else on the committee as well. You all really went into great depth with this and put in a lot of work.
Good. All right, thank you. So we'll go to the second round and then maybe do a check-in. So I have Ms. Springsteen, Mr. Abel, and then Ms. Johnson.
So a couple of other questions, and again, going back to my experience in Denver. So one of the things happening in Denver is that a lot of folks, elderly and minority folks, are being pushed out by gentrification. Their property values have gone up so much, taxes have gone up so much. And so what we have very often is elderly people trying to age in place and find a way to pay their taxes. And so they're using these short-term rentals to do this kind of thing. And so one of the questions I've always had is, do we have an issue with discrimination or the Fair Housing Act with regard to enforcing this stuff against the elderly? And so the example I would use in Denver again is some folks I know who are in their 80s who have been the subject of investigations and a lot of difficulties with trying to maintain their short-term rental. And so that's one of my questions, and maybe it's a legal question, I'm not sure. And then, but you know, this is such a complex issue, and so watching what they do in Denver, where the rules are not always consistent. Like, somebody can take off to France for a year and rent out their primary residence short-term rental, but somebody else who is living there and renting, you know, over the 30 days can get in trouble. And there's just, they have just come into this morass of rules. And so I'm just wondering, how do we avoid all of these complications, especially in terms of enforcement, when we're talking about code enforcement being the way to enforce this? What I have heard from a lot of my constituents is that that code enforcement is having a hard time just enforcing what we have at this point in time. And so what are we adding in terms of what we're going to need to actually do this and make it fair and non-discriminatory? And I wanted to address Ms. Johnson's question. In Denver, the way they figure out if you're going over the 29 days is the enforcement people go on the sites and look at your advertisements, and they ask for calendars. They ask for additional information. They have broad-ranging powers to ask for additional documents from people, and then they can criminally prosecute. And so a lot of people are very scared about this whole situation. And the reason I brought up the age issue here is some of the constituents we've heard from, they've said that over 60% of these short-term rentals are done by elderly people in Lakewood. And so they're depending on that income. And this is why I say this is such a complicated issue, and shouldn't we be leaving this up to the voters and the people who live with this every day. If this is not, I heard somebody say this is not considered an in-home business, it doesn't fit within the categories, then we're getting into that whole issue of like parking for an in-home business has to be in front of your own house. So we're going to have this whole, are we going to have this whole set of different rules for different people throughout the city? That I think that's a concern. And then just again, has there been any real hard analysis on what is this going to cost the city versus, what we get in return in terms of licensing fees or so forth? It sounds to me like it's going to cost the city a lot more than what we're going to get out of it. So I'm sorry, that was kind of rambling, but these are some of my concerns having dealt with it in Denver. Thanks.
Thank you. Yep, certainly a lot of different communities engaged right now in this. So the one that kind of stuck out for me, I'm just trying to translate, so forgive me. Fair Housing Act and discrimination as to our elderly folks, and how does this apply? Is that something somebody could answer? And then I think the cost one is we're still, that's part of our, we'll do it the best we can, but we're gonna have to learn as we go forward. Ms. Hodson, did you want to?
Yeah, I would ask Greg Graham to respond to that question.
Hello again. There are some issues that are, that can be brought up that can look like discrimination. The FHA, the Fair Housing Act, does allow for licensing, for example, in-home daycares, that kind of thing. In this particular instance, I don't personally see. Nobody has asked me that question before, so I'm actually glad Ms. Springsteen brought that up. So it's something we should probably take a look at, just to put your minds at ease, and then maybe send you a memo. But by and large, creation of a licensing scheme, like this wouldn't create a legal liability for the city as far as the discrimination issue is concerned.
Okay, so Mr. Abel and then Ms. Johnson, and then see if we have some sort of direction, and then we'll keep going.
Thank you, Mayor. One of my big concerns is that there are some places over in on the east side of Sheridan that are virtual flop houses. If you don't remember what flop houses are, they are defined as a cheap hotel-like setting, primarily for people who have no home and very little money. Certainly they need a place to stay. The ones that I'm familiar with in Denver have up to 11 people staying in a basement, 11 men staying in a basement with 11 bunk beds, a small kitchen and a small table. Can we prevent that sort of operation from, and are we going to be able to put occupancy limits on these things? Can 12 people come and stay in a little ADU that somebody built behind their house to accommodate short-term rentals? So firstly, how do we keep these as homes away from home, and even in places where there are single people using them as temporary residents while they work for a living? But how can we keep that from becoming flop houses where there are any number of folks exiting through a neighborhood every morning and returning every evening. And
Councilor Abel, I can probably answer that for you. In the elicitation document,
and the occupancy limits.
Occupancy is a bit tougher because obviously that's what happens inside the home. But for the number of agreements, the commission looked at that pretty in depth, and you can either allow a single contract to be in existence at one time, meaning that if I contract to rent the home, I'm the only one who can be there at that time. So that's how you would prevent that. There's also the option to say multiples. Many cities have gone to a single rental contract can be in existence at any one time in order to have that measure of eliminating what you just described, that situation where you just described. The occupancy numbers are a bit tougher because from a code enforcement standpoint, if you're not able to gain access to the home and count heads, but that's why the placard posting those numbers there and doing other methods where the neighbors know the numbers and that type of thing, that starts to work to help that. So if the occupancy is limited at 4, obviously neighbors would be able to see if 12 people are marching into the home. So again, none of this is perfect. Certainly we know we had some lively discussion about all that, but those are the mechanisms that other communities have used in order to not have rooming houses. I prefer not to call it a flop house, but more of a rooming type of a house situation.
A rooming house usually provided meals as well. And then my other, I think that we should fill in a couple of those blanks. I think we as council should decide the distance, how far apart these things can be. Because that is the only way, I guess, we can limit the number of short-term rentals in the city. I don't think we want one in every private residence in the house. So, I think we need to, as a council, decide not just that, but the notice limit as well. Neighbors on either side of you are not the only folks on the block affected by these things. So I think we should do at least a block on both sides of the street and include the contact information, not just for the owner, but should the owner be out of town while these things are being rented, we need to have something in place. Either require him, the owner, him or her, or they, to be home anytime they have a rental contract to occupy the primary house, or to have a 24-hour management service that the neighbors can summon in case there's a problem. So I think notice has to be enlarged in both ways, and as well as when you decide you're going to put one of these things in. Also, what happens with a new home buyer who comes to the neighborhood shopping on a Saturday and with a real estate agent and doesn't know they're buying a home right next door to a short-term rental? So I think if current residents need to be notified, so do potential future residents. So figure out a solution for those things, and I'm done. Thank you.
And I think 2 of those things are figured out. The 24-hour contact is going to be part of that. And then we have to figure out whether it's an owner occupied, where the person has to be there or not. So I think those will continue to come. Ms. Johnson, then Ms. Harrison.
Thank you. I would like to go back to the issue of occupancy. Obviously, if that's per bedroom or what, but the reality is, I don't know how that can even be enforced. And again, listening to the discussion here, having the sign on the inside of the house with occupancy 24/7 hour notification, parking and different things, does not help the neighbors. The neighbors need to have a sign on the outside as well so that they know what's going on. And again, we are putting neighbors in the position of being watchdogs for a commercial business, basically, that's right next to them. I don't recall, even though I was on the committee, if part of the Good Neighbor program in which neighbors are notified of this have the ability to nix one on their block if they don't want it, whether there's a homeowner association in place or not. You know, people, when you buy a home in a neighborhood, you've got zoning in place that you have certain expectations of the way that your neighborhood is going to look, certainly your block. And these short-term rentals are businesses. And if you find that there is a block someplace where people have real objection, just notifying them, to me, does not go the full length of what we need to be looking at. If folks don't want one, then I think that they should have the ability to say, we will not support having this on our block. Thank you.
Okay, so I now have Mr. LeBear, Mr. Skilling, who haven't chimed in, and then Ms. Harrison.
Yeah, just a quick question. I was just curious if the police department goes out to one of these residents, if there's some sort of requirement, like notification requirement to the clerk and recorder's office or whoever's doing the licensing.
Question. Mr. Smith, have we tuned that in yet, or is that more detail that could come?
That's more detail that could come along the way. The general intent is for the departments to work together. So if the police are responding to these sorts of things, they know that it's a short-term rental with a licensure on there, then they would inform the city clerk's office that they've been out for that visitation. And then some level of determination of, is that a minor violation or a major violation, or what transpired and how does that work? All of those details are not necessarily figured out there, but obviously if the police are responding to something, they're going to want to make certain that if there's a short-term rental involved with that the licensing part of the process is aware of the fact that they've responded to something that's happened at that site.
Okay, great. That was my main question. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks. Mr. Skilling, and then Ms. Harrison, and then let's see if we have a consent, then Ms. Franks.
Just briefly, I'll ask this somewhat rhetorically, but why wouldn't we, for occupancy, why wouldn't we just follow the same rules that we have for occupancy for every other house in Lakewood? Long-term, short-term rent, whatever. Seems like a easy one. That is all.
Good rhetorical question. Ms. Harrison and then Ms. Franks.
Are you ready for comments yet, or we're still? Okay, then I keep going.
Ms. Franks?
I just wanted to answer Councillor Johnson's question that yes, we did talk about the Good Neighbor program in a little bit more detail. I don't know if we were keeping copious meeting minutes at that time, but the discussions surrounded, like, let's say I had Barb's tax service. The neighbors don't get to weigh in whether I can operate that from my home, if I register as a business. So I just wanted to provide that layer of additional information that it was discussed, but we don't really give other business owners don't have, the neighbors don't have the right to say, no, you can't operate your tax service out of your home office. So again, just a little bit more texture there.
All right, council. So I got to emphasize, we're probably not all going to agree, and I don't want us to have to hash out all of our opinions tonight, but I want to see if there is a consensus, if council wants to move forward with adopting an ordinance that would allow these, or not, which would then be another ordinance that would put us into making sure we have more context to, basically banning them. I want to get a consensus so the community can hear that. Then I'd like to go to public input. and then we can go back to answering some of these last questions, and certainly there's going to be a lot more input needed no matter which way we go. So I have the top of my screen, Ms. Franks, Ms. Harrison, Mr. Beta.
Oh, did I forget to take my hand down, or were you looking for general comments on what our thoughts are?
No, your hand is up, so I was
I'm sorry.
The top. That's
All
okay.
right.
Okay. All right, Mr. Beta.
Thank you. So are we ready to give comments on this before we go for determining the consensus? Or are you going to do that after we hear from the public?
No, I'd like the public to at least hear so they know what to weigh in on, if we're weighing in on moving forward with an ordinance or not. So,
okay.
And again, no matter which way we go, there's going to be a lot more time for council to really dig in and give their opinion. So I'm just really looking for a quick yes or no.
You don't want any reasoning or what our thought processes are? I mean, seems to me that should be important as to how we've arrived at our decision of whether to move forward or not individually.
Well,
and that's what I would like to weigh in on at some point here before you take a determination of a consensus or not.
Well,
certainly, yes or no doesn't mean anything unless you have some reason.
Okay. Again, like I said, this is going to be rehashed again in some form or fashion. I'm just trying to be judicious with our time and everybody's time tonight. So please, if you feel comfortable giving your reasoning for why you support this or don't, that's fine. Council, if the rest of you just feel like, yeah, I want to go one way or another, that'd be super helpful too. So the floor is yours, Mr. Beta.
Thank you, Mayor. I was one of the committee members who was opposed to allowing these STRs to go forward. Some of my reasons are as follows, and I won't get into all of them, but some of the major ones. I'm concerned that once we allow them, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to pull back later and prohibit them if we decide that this was not a good decision. To me, it's like letting the genie out of the bottle, opening Pandora's box, whatever you want, analogy you want to use, but once you do it, you can't go back. It's going to be very difficult. And I think part of the reason I say that is because we've already got them operating in here in Lakewood, and it's going to be, we understand that it's going to be somewhat difficult to now, if we decide to go forward and not allow them, to try and to enforce a prohibition against those that are already in existence. STRs go against the reason that we have zoning. Residential and commercial uses are very different, and our zoning laws recognize that. And we recognize that they do not mix well. Yet STRs do that very thing. They mix residential use with commercial use. One of the points that came up was talking about aging in place. And I have to tell you that if I had data that indicated that, most of the STRs that are operating are being done by elderly seniors that are trying to age in place, and I would certainly have to take a different look at this, but I don't believe that. And I'll tell you why I don't believe it, because I've known people that have operated these short-term rentals. And it is not just a simple matter. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of work. You have to, first of all, you have to be competitive. You have to offer a competitive product. That means that it has to have amenities. It has to be clean. It has to be everything working properly. That takes a lot of work. You have to market your product. You have to make sure that you can collect for your product, for your services. Those all take a lot of work. Anybody that has run a business knows that that takes a lot of work and time and effort. And someone that's 80 years old, I just don't believe is going to have the wherewithal or the desire to engage in that kind of energy. Another reason I think enforcement is a huge issue here, as the city, we don't have the current resources to adequately enforce our current laws through code enforcement. Therefore, we are very selective in what we do enforce. The current 300 plus SDRs currently operating illegally in Lakewood is a case in point. I'm opposed to having the neighbors be the enforcers, as has been mentioned by other counselors, by having a complaint-driven system, which is by and large what we have in Lakewood now on other codes. Such a system puts neighbors against neighbor and results in friction between neighbors. It is up to the city to enforce its laws and codes, not the neighbors. Unfortunately, we do not have a history of city enforcement. And I think that it would be somewhat misleading to the community if we pass rules with the idea that, in the promise that these rules are going to be enforced. There are approximately 300 STRs in operation currently. This has been a consistent number for several years, and I understand that it's a guess, as was discussed. We have approximately 70,000 dwelling units in Lakewood, some of which are not operating or not suitable for an SDR. We don't know how many of those are not suitable, but that still leaves a very large number of dwellings who choose not to offer STRs. I think this is an indication that we would be passing such legislation for the benefit of only a tiny percent of homeowners. There's also the issue of affordability of housing. Allowing these STRs reduces housing inventory for residents. It increases rents, it increases prices of housing. As one of our public comments noted, single-family home ownership is part of the American dream, and demand for live-in ownership is at an all-time high in Lakewood as well as throughout the country. STRs are contrary to family home ownership. The fact that many other cities are allowing them is not a good reason for Lakewood to follow. In fact, it's just the opposite. If a person wants to operate as STR, there are ample opportunities to do so in other jurisdictions, like Denver, Wheat Ridge, Arvada, Fort Collins, Breckenridge, or Aspen. Lakewood is different than those cities and should stay different. Lakewood does not have to be like everyone else. In our part of the country, we have set of principles that we strive to live by. It's a code, if you will, and that code includes principles like honesty, loyalty, pride, and courage. It also includes a principle that some things are just not for sale, not at any price. I believe that includes our neighborhoods, our families, and our way of life. SDRs put a price on our way of life. I cannot do that, and nor should you. So I ask you to consider these as you decide to move forward. Mayor, I yield the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Patterson?
I think what you were asking for is a quick yes or no. And mine would be yes, because I think we still don't have all the answers to really be able to make a good decision. So I would say yes.
Thank you. Mr. Abel, Ms. Vincent, Ms. Gutwein, Ms. Springsteen. Mr. Abel, you're muted.
Thank you. I have a couple of points for the process. They may even be points of order. Firstly, I think our community members should be able to speak as to whether they want these or not hear us reach a consensus now that would render those pro or anti-comment, one side or the other, useless. On the other hand, what you're doing, Mayor, by asking us to say yay or nay tonight, you're asking us to vote up or down on whether we're going to have STRs in the city. We can only do that at a public hearing. So I would suggest that we let both sides be discussed tonight, that we hold open the no option, and that any consensus we reach tonight has to do with the process and not the specifics. Then next week, or 2 weeks hence, when we get this back with all the blanks filled in, we're not already in the position of saying, oh yeah, we voted for this in study session. You know, we have a majority. I think we need to stay away from the appearance of approving something outside public hearing.
Okay.
So, to accomplish that, we have to leave the no option open. That's whether we go for it next time or not is to be decided then in public hearing. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So just to clarify, council, we don't take votes at study sessions.
Yeah.
We're trying to give staff direction, which we always do at study sessions. And certainly everybody will have their opportunity to vote yes or no, depending upon how we move forward. So the process is what we've done in my 14 years on this council, and that's what I'm trying to get us through. We've had this issue before us for 2 years. And so, you know, I think there's definitely people who are going to agree and disagree, and that's fine. But I want to keep moving along and give staff some sort of idea of what to do.
Fine. I think we give them the idea that they go ahead and compile the ordinance.
Mr. Abel, I think
on next week, and I would rather have a legal opinion on my point of order.
Okay, your
on
point
what
of order
we
was
can
taken
approve tonight and whether we can reject this tonight. So I'd like a legal opinion on it, sir.
Your point of order was taken, and I explained what the process is. We're not voting on anything. We're trying to give direction. Thank you. Ms. Vincent?
You're wrong.
Yeah, I don't know where we're at now. I was just going to say that I'd like to move forward with getting an ordinance, and then I realized that later we can do up or down, and we'll have more public comment, I'm sure. I'm sure.
So do you, but staff needs clarification as to what kind of ordinance. Do we want to?
Oh, I'm sorry. Moving.
Yes. Do we want to
Yes.
move forward? Okay.
Yes.
So what is that clarification, please?
I want to move forward on an ordinance to have STRs.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Yes. Well, I have Ms. Springsteen, Ms. Gutwein, Mr. LeBeer.
Well, I guess my concern is just if there's so few complaints and so few short-term rentals in the city, 300 in a city of 70,000 dwellings, why are we doing this? And why are we creating all these laws if it's not necessary? I guess what I would say is I don't feel comfortable voting about whether these should be allowed or not. I think that should be up to the voters and the people of the city of Lakewood, just like trash was. So I'm going to not be voting yes or no tonight.
Okay, and just to clarify, we don't vote yes or no. We're giving consensus on which way to go with an ordinance. So just so everybody is clear.
Well, let me clarify. So my understanding was we're voting on whether these should be allowed in the city or not.
No, we're giving staff direction as to preparing an ordinance. And either there's two options that were presented after all this discussion by the committee. Does the city council want to direct staff to create rules allowing these to be regulated under the regulatory body or not? That's what we're asking.
To create rules to allow them or not create rules about it.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Springsteen. Either way, we need rules because right now we don't have rules right now. Case in point is the fact that we do have these operating. We don't really know. We have a bed and breakfast ordinance, which is kind of tied. So it's really goofy. And so we need to either have an outright 100% regulated ban or a regulated program.
So we're voting either to have an ordinance allowing them or to have no ordinance is what we're voting.
The direction would be given to go either way, to either not to, we'd still need an ordinance either way, an ordinance to not allow them or an ordinance to allow them. And then if you wanted to take something to the voters, you'd have to figure out what ordinance you want to take to the voters.
But we're voting whether to allow them or not allow them.
No, we would have to go through a first reading and a second reading to do that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, but the one ordinance would allow, the one wouldn't. So
we're giving, just like we have done on everything ordinance that's come through a study session, we're giving that direction, and council may decide, I want to hear more from the community. I want to see rules put forth. What do those rules look like? And then on second reading, they may vote those down.
I think that's confusing. I don't know. We're voting to allow them or not. And I say, I'm not going to vote on that.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Gutwein?
Thank you. So, I do think this is certainly a complex issue and we've been working on it for a long time. I just have a couple of thoughts that I want to share and then some feedback for our consensus moving forward. I think that, as I'm looking at this, I certainly think we need to consider the neighborhood impact, which is something we've been talking about a lot. And some counselors have brought out kind of the impact of the homeowner that may want to have one of these. And that's something that I really think we have to consider as well. Aging in place is one thing that was raised, and I think that's a really important thing to think about. Friends of mine that have gone through hard times during, the last year in other cities have opened these up. One recently became a single mother, and she opened a short-term rental, and this is how she got through this year. And so I just feel like this is something that honestly is important income for people. It's not for everyone. We only have the 300 as has been mentioned, or that's a kind of approximate number. And so I think it's certainly worth continuing this conversation. So I would like to see that move forward. Some additional consensus or input, I guess, is I think a lot of the recommendations from the committee I really agree with. For example, requiring it to be owner occupied or house sharing rather than an investment property. Noise and sound and stuff like that, I think is really, the quiet hours, I think is really important. And then one concern I have though is about the distance between them. And it just doesn't feel like the most fair way we could regulate that. I certainly appreciate the concern about, we don't want to see an entire neighborhood becoming a hotel, I think is kind of what the concern is. But it doesn't feel necessarily fair if one person has one on the street and then, the neighbor down the block wants to do it at a totally different, we're limiting the number of days, doing a lot to regulate this. It just feels like maybe we could look at a different way. Another option that I saw is they did a max for the city. And so, that's maybe an option, is that we could look at a maximum number for the city and then evaluate from there. I think that is where I will stop for now. Thank you for your time.
All right, Ms. Johnson.
This is complicated. I do agree with everything that Mike said. I just have a few other things I'd like to say. And knowing how to vote is complicated too, because I would like to see us either have a ordinance that says we will not allow them in the city, or else put it to a vote of the people and basically have a referendum. And I'm not sure how that fits in the way that you're trying to do this, but there's just a few things I'd like to add. Although the number 300 has been thrown out there, personally, I think there's probably a whole lot more of them. And all these years, even at the top of this document, the Elicitation Document, the very first thing that it says is that they are not permitted in the city of Lakewood. We have not enforced that. The first time that City Council got an update on this, I believe, was in 2015. We've known for years these are out there, and we've kind of turned our face and just kind of let them be. The people, for the most part, most of them that are running them know that they're illegal. They have their own organization, which is interesting. And they are profiting, in my opinion, at the expense of the neighbors. There's an interesting sidebar on this. A year ago, when we were hearing our budget talks, there were different items that the finance folks were looking at for revenue enhancers. And of course, one of them was taxing marijuana, and one of them was taxing short-term rentals. So that's been out there for a year. We can all go back and look at those documents. One thing I have learned in public policy is that once you go forward with something, and if there's issues with it, it takes years to turn it around and to make the needed changes and to tighten up something that we didn't have the foresight to begin with to understand and to see. Once you make this legal, it's hard to turn that back. It took, our rewrite of our zoning ordinance was in 2012, and it took several years of people bringing up issues with that and for us to make needed changes to that. And during that time, the neighborhoods actually are suffering. There was an interesting article in the Denver Post in January of 2019 from a gentleman, James Carlson. He's a Denver real estate broker. And he was saying, quote, "The trajectory in the metro area is to restrict short-term rentals more and more. Once they're in place, people are learning by mistakes of what's going on with the neighbors in those neighborhoods. We need to learn from them." I think there's also something to be said for creating unfair competition with our short-term quality suites and our hotels in our city. They are paying a lodging tax. These, for years, have not done that. It has created unfair competition. Again, there's usually tension when you get these in place between the owner of the house and the neighbors. And God knows we've got enough tensions in our neighborhoods the way it is without legitimizing it. Again, something that Mike mentioned, when you buy a home in a residential area, we all expect to have the sanctity of that residential area to stay in place through our zoning ordinances. It feels like we are circumventing that. I don't think any of us have difficulty with an elderly person in their home renting out their basement in order to have a caregiver to supplement their income. But what's going on from the people that we have all met, this is more than that. And we are joking if we think that by not having an owner stay in the home the entire time that it's being rented out, that's okay. None of us are going to leave our underwear in our bedrooms to have somebody else come in and stay for 30 days or longer. I mean, you really need to think of what we're doing here. These short-term rentals, they need to have regular site inspections for public health and safety issues. And I don't know where that's going to come from, where the staff's going to come from. We are basically turning our neighborhoods into quasi-businesses. And, Lakewood is not a destination city. These work out great in Breckenridge and Aspen where they're skiing. We're not a destination city. If somebody wants to stay 30 days, there's a quality suite not that far away. I'm very, very strong that if this kind of thing does go forward, and I will not be supporting it, that owner needs to be there 24/7. It needs to be their full-time residence, not just half-time. And all of the parking in these needs to be on site. That gets gained in these residential neighborhoods. And of course, there's noise issues. And once again, we don't have a way to measure that with decibels. We are also, because we have recreational pot, we're not being honest with ourselves if we're not going to realize there's going to be odors coming out of these homes. And, if people are gone and in and out, it's hard to enforce that kind of thing, but that's the reality of these. Again, we're putting our neighbors in the positions of babysitting houses of somebody else to keep them in compliance. I'm not sure what we're supposed to vote on here. A yes to go forward with having an ordinance that says that they are not going to be allowed, voting to have an ordinance that would basically become a referendum and go to the street, to the people. That's fine, but I do not support them. So I'm not sure in which category I fit.
Thank you. So you fit in the category of no, and if not no, then you fit in the category of send it to the voters. So I haven't heard from our Ward 4 folks, or is there anybody else who would like to share some consensus? Jacob, did you weigh in? I'm not sure. I'm sorry.
I haven't, but I'm happy to. I'll try to make it brief, but I just wanted to throw the comments in there just in case this is part of the building the framework. I do think we should move forward with the regulatory framework being designed and then for us to vote on for having short-term rentals. So I'd be happy to support moving forward with that. I do think a couple of things. I think it'd be great if we could figure out a way to carve in some element of multifamily in this, townhomes or condos or something to that effect. Obviously, HOAs can do what they want and hop in on that conversation at their level, but I think we shouldn't exclude them. I think typically higher density multifamily housing is closer to larger infrastructure that could actually support potentially increased traffic. I actually doubt there would be a whole lot of increased traffic. If the homeowner's not there and somebody's renting out the house, it's probably just swapping one car for another in a lot of cases. But we could have all those conversations later. But I think we should try to carve in some of multifamily housing. I think Littleton does it. I think a lot of other cities have that as well. So, maybe we just cap it at X number of units or something like that. I think that would be the way to to take a look at it. I think the good neighborhood agreements I think are nice, but I think we should be wary about being too having too much regulations like that, being too stringent. That's my view. In part because of what, for example, Councilor Beta mentioned, to the effect of, I don't want the neighbors necessarily too involved with my property. And on the same token, nobody's going to regulate better than these apps and these companies. You get to review the person who stayed at your house, and their ability to even rent these type of properties is predicated on you being a good tenant or a good renter. So if you're not doing a good job of being a renter, you get a low rating, you get kicked off the app. And it works the other way too. If you're a bad property owner and not taking care of things, and things are dirty and gross and not safe, the person renting the property can rate you poorly, and then you don't have the ability to rent to others. So a lot of these, I think, are pretty self-contained and self-regulated. I think a lot of the concerns that we've all brought up really come down to enforcement and code enforcement from the city side. But as you mentioned, if we think that the city is not doing as good of a job as it could enforcing things on the neighborhood level, well, that's true with or without STRs. And in fact, STRs actually have another layer of regulation and enforcement in it, in that you get to regulate each other on these apps. So I think they're actually probably better regulated than the neighbor next door. We talk about things like marijuana, stuff like that. My neighbor can smoke up right now, and there's not a whole lot I can do other than calling the police or maybe beating on the wall. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, but I'm happy to move it forward and keep having these conversations. I think there's plenty of things to work out and talk about, but that's support moving forward.
Ms. Franks.
Thanks, Mayor Paul. I'll try to keep it brief. Certainly at this point, obviously, we have had major discussions. I think we started this conversation back in 2019. I am probably the primary reason why it got delayed and sent over to the Housing Policy Commission, because I felt it was a topic that was complex enough that it needed that level of engagement. I certainly put in a ton of time on this, and I know others did as well. Rehashing the same points isn't at this point helpful. I think I just want to kind of share with people. We've heard, on the Housing Policy Commission, we went through these things line by line. People have very strong opinions about this. Our job is to represent our constituents. I do want to say that the information that I sent back, we had a company who actually used their software tool to let us know how many roughly were operating in Lakewood at the time. It was a lot larger than the 300 that was sent to all the Housing Policy Commission folks. I know that maybe it was a lot of information. We also used a lot of our time to learn from our neighbors. Obviously, other communities have been working through this. Many continue to work through it. I think that capping at a total number of units for a city is somewhat problematic. Other communities have found that you end up with concentrated units in certain areas, and then that in itself creates a problem. So no matter what direction we go, there's going to be, it's not going to be perfect is what I'm trying to get to. And I am in support of moving the discussion forward, but I do want my community to know that I was one of the counselors who certainly we all said no to the commercial, but on these short-term rentals for homeowner and home sharing, I was the one who was undecided, because ultimately it is the strength of those regulations and how the program fits together. It was going to be necessary for me to decide whether I can ultimately support it or not. I do believe in, maintaining our neighborhood character. I also believe in property rights. We allow other types of businesses. So I'll be looking at this very holistically, saying, what do I see as the potential impacts? But Mayor, to answer your question, I'm in support of moving forward for the ordinance crafting a very narrow for the homeowner home sharing one. But for me, it's going to come all the way down to what are the guardrails and what do I assess as the impact to my community, which would then control my final vote. Thanks.
Thank you. I would just echo that in my opinion as well. Certainly support moving it forward. It's important to find a balance with our neighbors in the neighborhoods, and being on the Housing Policy Committee, I think that's something we've really strived to do. I think there's, a lot of things that can happen and will happen. And if we get to a point, I think, where it's too onerous and it doesn't make sense, then certainly I don't know if it's worth my support, if and when it comes to a second reading. But I think we need to go through and continue to have these different conversations. And again, for folks, sometimes no is just okay. No is no, and yes is yes, and that's okay. That's what we're here to do. We're also here to move policy along. And one of the things that I have is, we are elected by our constituencies to, make these challenging decisions. And, our community has trust in each and every one of us that we're going to represent them in the ways that they elected us to do. And there's no shame in that. And sometimes something's going to pass and sometimes something's not. And we've all been on each side of that. But from what I can gather, there is a consensus to have some language move forward in the affirmative of allowing, and there's still some more questions to ask. We still do have another agenda item, which I will do a check in, but I do need to get to public input as well. So I would like to do that. I do have two hands up, Mr. Beta and Mr. Abel.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to make sure that if it wasn't clear, that my preference would be to instruct staff to draft an ordinance which clearly prohibits STRs in Lakewood, and that would also provide for proactive enforcement. So that would be my, in case that wasn't clear.
No, you were crystal clear.
All right.
There was no misunderstanding.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. Mr. Abel?
Well, I agree with you both. We do need to move forward and craft the ordinance that would allow this. But Mayor, you said you'd have to see it before you know how you're going to vote on it. What happens if we move forward and we have that single ordinance in front of us and then we vote no? Then staff has to go back and compile an ordinance just to the flavor that Mr. Beta described, saying that, no, we're not going to allow it, and this is how we're going to enforce it. So I just want to be cautious. Move it forward and let's put the ordinance together, but let's also include an ordinance or include a backup so that if we decide it is too onerous in 2 weeks, we have the fallback ordinance already prepared. And it doesn't look like we're already voting to say, yes, we're going to do this. We need the backup. That's all. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Okay, so let's see here. We'll now go to the public input portion. This is your opportunity to weigh in and ask any questions. This is different than the public hearing, general public comment. It's certainly just related to this conversation tonight. It's your opportunity to ask questions about what we're doing and give that kind of input. I will have the clerk give the last 4 digits of the phone number and ask you to give your name and or ward, or name and ward, or name and address. I'll start your 30 seconds. I'll let you know when, or start your 3 minutes. I'll let you know when 30 seconds is up, and then ask you to politely wrap up. And again, this is not general public comment. That happens on our 2nd and 4th Monday meetings. So Mr. Clerk, please.
7458.
Good evening, 7458. If you give us your name and address or ward, we'll get you going.
Yes, this is Nick, and I'm in Ward 2, and I operate a duplex that is an Airbnb and I've operated it for 2.5 years. No complaints from any of my neighbors. They have my phone number. If there's an issue, they call me. The other part is, for a while, we were being taxed by the platform as if we were in Denver, and Denver would have gotten $18,000 from last year's tax for lodging. I'm all for Lakewood taxing this even higher than what you're asking for, because we don't pay that. Our guests pay that. That's what we want from the city. We want people to come in here and spend their money and earn revenue for our city. And Airbnb has found out that Airbnb guests spend an average of $200 a day more than hotel guests in the surrounding businesses. So I think this is good for our city. And with over 300, some say well over 300 Airbnbs already, we only get from code enforcement 16 to 17 complaints a year. We get more than that just from long-term tenants in the neighborhood. So I think I'd really like to see this go on, and what you're doing by not allowing multifamilies is you're putting these into residential neighborhoods. We're in a multifamily neighborhood where everyone is a tenant, and that's less impact on the homeowners of the city. So I think we should consider that. Thank you for your efforts here.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Mr. Clerk, next.
Yes, we have Taylor.
Good evening, Taylor.
Hey everyone, my name is Taylor Hills, and I actually don't live in Lakewood, but I own and operate a business that manages vacation rentals in Lakewood. So I appreciate everyone's attention to this, and I think that there is some very good points brought up on all sides, and I've been heavily involved in the regulatory process here in Denver, and we've hosted good neighbor summits on, teaching hosts how to be responsible neighbors and making sure that you're leaving a positive impact on the neighborhood. So I appreciate your guys' efforts in keeping that in mind moving forward. But I would just state and kind of reiterate what Jacob stated, which is, this is something that's happening already. It is, not technically legal, but it's still already happening. So I think the city is moving in a good direction of regulating it and profiting from it. And if you look at Denver's revenue that's been generated over the past few years, they've made millions and millions and millions of dollars from it. So I think that there is a way to legalize it, make it a taxable event, and have it pay for itself. I also think that there's some common sense practices that could be put in place. One being making sure that individuals have a larger trash can if they're going to be operating a short-term rental. Secondly, one of the things that we've always pushed from day one is noise monitoring devices in each unit that don't monitor conversations, but they do in fact monitor sound decibels, and making that a requirement. Putting a placard in the unit is great. I think Breckenridge does that. Putting it outside of the unit seems like a liability. You don't need neighbors walking up to people's properties and reading information that's on the side of their house and freaking out a guest that is potentially in the property that thinks there's criminal activity going on. Anyways, I just would like to offer any of my opinions or services, not advertising our services, but happy to weigh in on any conversations in the future regarding smart regulation. I think Denver handled it pretty well, but at the same time, there was a lot of lessons to be learned. And I think that they were pretty strict in their regulation.
30 seconds.
And I think it's a smart move to apply a little bit of regulations, see how the community and the hosting community and the neighboring community reacts to a few regulations, and then readdress any issues as time goes on and apply more regulations if needed. But just going in and putting, 30 different regulations on the industry right out the gate when this is something new for the community is not the right approach. Anyways, appreciate everything that you guys are doing, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Next, we have the gadfly.
All right, good evening. If you give us your name and address or name and ward.
Hello, Mayor. It's your favorite gadfly, Eric Brandt, and I'm still living inside my body, thankfully. Anyway, I think this is a great idea, and I'd like to tell you where this is going. But you definitely need to do this. First of all, Lakewood needs more regulation. With COVID, law enforcement has been terribly out of work lately, and we definitely need to give them something more to do in these boring economic downturn times. Speaking of the economy, this is a great time to create more enforcement because everybody's about to lose their homes and be foreclosed upon and whatnot, you know, where they've been already relying on rentals and they don't have jobs and COVID still has everybody shut down. So I think this is a great move forward for the city of Lakewood to be more concerned about increasing the regulation on its people and none of that pesky, what are we going to do to take care of people? Right? I mean, people talk about the government's purpose is to protect people. We all know that that's not true. We all know that the purpose of government is so that the elite can make more money. You would know a lot about this, of course, Mayor, because you've done such a good job with these assisted living centers. You haven't been able to enforce dirty diapers in front of Ms. Springsteen's house for 8 years. What makes you think you can enforce rules that already aren't being enforced? You're a pretty funny guy. Anyway, at least with the nursing home, you get a kickback. I don't know. I mean, obviously, this law is to get rid of those pesky students and what are those other people that like to live in high dense family communities? Yeah, get rid of the sticks for sure. You know, the ones that actually spend money in your community. Brilliant. I definitely think it's a good idea. And furthermore, this is an awesome opportunity to get an opportunity for your neighbors to narc on your neighbors. In Cuba, they have a name for this group. It's called the committee, in quotes, the committee. And you want to know what happens to people that are on the committee in Cuba? Well, some days they don't come home and they find their dismembered bodies down the street. So if you really want good old-fashioned law disorder and dismemberment of bodies in your neighborhood, then you need to pass more ordinances that encourage neighbors to narc on neighbors. Don't worry, we have a plan for this. This has happened before. All we need to do is roll the clock back to 1945 and take a look at Nazi Germany. You're doing a great job, Mayor, and I want to give you my full support.
Hey, so
and have a such a top day.
Nine, 6, 7, 8.
Good evening, 9678. Give us your name and address, and we'll get you going.
Hi, good evening, James. Speaking from Ward 4 this evening. Trust you guys can hear me okay.
Yep.
I wanted to thank everyone again for their work. As a member of the Lakewood Short-Term Rental Alliance, we took a lot of time and effort to try to consolidate our 80-member strong audience to get comments to you all. A lot of those were sent via email. I hope we made some salient points that could be considered. There were a few things from this evening's conversation that struck me, and the first is to just take issue, Ms. Johnson, when you speak of this not being a destination city. I think it's some of these archaic attitudes that are holding us back. My experience has been the opposite, that people do want to come to experience maybe a show at Red Rocks, some fine dining at Belmar, and certainly the myriad open space that our city has to offer for hiking and trails. And I think it's a lot of these attitudes that are holding us back. Very contentious issue. I can see both sides of it, but I can't quite see how the city of Lakewood would outright ban short-term rentals. Hopefully, again, our comments from our 80-member strong alliance have been circulated and considered. I haven't heard them reflected tonight, although I felt like I heard a couple of things, perhaps in some of the council members' discussions, that maybe they did get a read of our proposals and the statements that we wrote from families and individuals that have had short-term rentals. Please understand, we are all in favor of the same things that you fear. Stated differently, we want to have safe places. We want to have places that aren't noisy. We want to have places that are free of trash. We want to have people that aren't blowing pot smoke out the windows. We want happy neighbors. We have had those things for years. So I encourage you to think about the economic benefit. This will not be a boon for the city, but you can offset the costs of enforcing and regulating a legitimized program. The other point to consider, as I understand it, as of March 1st, at least Airbnb was submitting sales tax to the city of Lakewood. So it kind of puts us in a tough spot to know that money is being sent to the Department of Revenue, Jefferson County, and potentially now the city of Lakewood, where we're still feeling like criminals for doing something that we should be entitled to as homeowners that pay our taxes on time every year and improve our properties, perhaps as a result of some extra income for hosting an empty room and meeting someone from a different part of the world or helping them with better affordable housing for a shorter term. Lastly, I would just say, please stop trying to reinvent this process. Ask the folks at Arvada, how has it been going? What has worked? What hasn't? It's a similar city. Denver's a little different. Breckenridge is wildly different. You can see across the state, the cities that have adopted this, they have reasonable tax rates. They are all in favor of strong safeguards, as is the Lakewood Short-Term Rental Alliance, and we're available anytime you guys would like to reach back to perhaps bounce something off our community. Thank you for your civic work and the time this evening.
Thank you.
0978.
0978, good evening. Give us your name and address or ward. We'll get you going.
Hello, Council. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. This is Mike Sidebottom from Ward 4. I pretty much anticipated hearing a lot of support on the phone tonight. I know that a lot of those folks came out to speak on what they believe. I think there's a lot of folks that feel the way I do that aren't, however. So I wanted to make sure that I did. I'm even in the industry, but the big deal for me is I live here too. And this just doesn't belong in Lakewood. I used to view Lakewood as a destination city. I've lived here 40 years. But anymore, it just doesn't feel that way. And it's just constantly continuing, in my opinion. And one of the issues for me that is a huge concern is, you know, I think Ms. Johnson said it pretty well. We buy and invest a lot of money, not as tenants, but homeowners, in specific communities that are appealing to us. And we grow and raise our kids there, and we get used to a quality of life. That's what Lakewood's always been to me. Your last caller just talked about open space. That's another one. And I've had a couple of short-term rentals very, very close in proximity to me, where I could actually hear the noise with closed windows and closed doors in the wintertime. It's horrific. And it finally went away. They got enough complaints. Street parking is out of control in this city. I don't know if people are using their garages for storage, but the cars on the streets are more than I've ever seen, even in my own neighborhood. And the streets just weren't built wide enough to support two parked cars and two passing cars. It's pretty tight. Parking, noise are obvious issues. But to learn tonight that there's actually companies that want to share in property renovation and share profits is just mind-blowing to me. And I see nothing but humongous problems coming about because of that. Everybody will, a lot of folks will jump on board with that have no business belonging a short-term rental property owner. And finally, the biggest issue, bar none, is enforcement. It's been my experience for quite some time now that a lot of the ordinances look good on paper, but they're just not being enforced. And this is an absolute enforcement nightmare. And you know, I think I've got some flexibility with, again, somebody elderly who wants an in-person occupant, but other than that, these should be disallowed, and that's what should make Lakewood stand out as a place you can go for some peace and quiet and not have to deal with this. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Yep, thank you. All right. Anybody else in the queue wish to speak?
8845.
8845. You are live. If your name and ward, name and address.
Good evening. This is Diane Duffy. I'm in Ward 1. And I've spoken to you on this issue before for a couple of years. there was a short-term rental next door to my mother, my elderly mother. And there were issues. And I listened to some of the comments that were some of the concerns that were just kind of broached by you this evening. And I can verify that those really exist. Now, if you can imagine that the house next door to you, wherever you live in Lakewood, is advertised on the internet as a 420 friendly cottage close to the mountains and Red Rocks with a hot tub and a greenhouse in the backyard. So 2 carloads with California plates pull up most every weekend, and the party begins. Now, this doesn't happen anymore because our Lakewood code enforcement and our police actually took care of the issue because this is a residential neighborhood, and we have ordinances that govern the noise level and the cars parked all over. So the situation did resolve itself. I want to caution you that if you move forward with this, you really need to contact the Jefferson County Code Enforcement, because we have another short-term rental here in our neighborhood that everything that you guys have brought up tonight has happened. The parking, the person who's supposed to live there, well, she moved away but left her son. Well, that didn't really help. The aroma, the cars all over, the parties, everything that you've mentioned has happened. And yes, it has pitted the whole block against this one neighbor. And it's really a bad situation. And Jefferson County, this is, as you may or may not know, my neighborhood is part in Lakewood and part in the county. And the county has been trying to deal with this. Code enforcement only has so many teeth to deal with this. And what they have found is there's no process for access. They're actually in litigation. We all remember the rodent people. We don't want another incident like that. You don't want to deal with it, and we don't. So you're going to have an awful lot. You're going to have to give a lot of teeth to the code enforcement people. And I encourage you to talk to the county and see what they've been dealing with. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, anybody else? Okay, seeing none, I will close public input. And certainly want to thank everybody. And I would like to emphasize one thing. We've received comments on all sides of this. So certainly, the community is engaged on all different sides. So we've heard a lot and seen a lot. So with some more direction and again, time check, it's 9:30 and we have a whole nother section to go through tonight. And if council chooses to postpone that, they can do that also. I think in development dialogue, some of the things that have worked well is kind of that menu approach. So when you look at, preparing an ordinance, do you want it owner occupied or not? So have that ready to go with kind of both those. Do you want 100-foot radius or 500-foot, right? Rather than trying to get 11 people to tune in on that tonight, it might be better suited for a second reading where those things can come into play. But I'm just throwing that out there because we need to continue to tune in. And Robert, if you want to maybe, if it's possible to throw back on those 4 things that you're kind of looking for, maybe we can go up for that. Ms. Johnson?
If you give me just a moment, I can bring that up. I do have the ordinance that we weren't able to bring up before. I think most people have read it, though. It was in the packet. Yeah. So I can bring up that outline in just a second.
Thank you.
I just received a message from someone who pressed 9 and was not able to get in. So are there other people on the line perhaps that would like to speak?
Yeah, none that have indicated they wish to speak.
Okay, this person pressed 9, so that's all I know. Thank you.
Yeah. Did they press star 9? Okay.
Mayor, I assume you want to bring up the things that we were looking for direction on. Is that the part of the memo that you wanted to bring up?
Please.
So there are the they're in the box bulleted points if you want there. Essentially the whether we should prepare further with the materials that we've talked about this evening and evolve those into something along the way, or should we prepare something that prohibits them outright? The other two were are there more specific direction on those left blank things? You alluded to that there's that kind of menu sort of an option, and there's lots of ways that we can approach that. One is that staff could make some suggestions or that sort of a thing. But essentially, when we bring the ordinance forward, it can also be modified if that's not quite the right numbers that are in those blanks there. And then are there amendments or things that we did not cover in there that that the council would like to see as we come forward with that ordinance? And again, the notion is that if the ordinance is not complete, it can be modified. If it can't be modified, it can also be rejected.
Yep. Okay. So council, is there anything within that realm that you would like to see? I mean, I certainly am okay with staff taking a crack at this based upon the feedback they've heard, as well as the conversations from the housing folks or the housing commission and coming back with us. So I have I have a bunch of hands up. So Ms. Franks, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Mayor Paul. I'm certainly fine with just moving forward with staff taking the leader moving forward. We provided them with a ton of information from which to leverage. Certainly, I'll be coming with prepared amendments or pre-written prepared amendments that I'll want to offer. For me, it's going to be about strengthening various components, and I'm sure other counselors will have some ideas as well. I would just encourage everyone to look at what is in the packet and then come with prepared amendments just to facilitate the evening. I think at this point, Mayor Paul kind of said it, there's going to be different opinion on both sides. I don't think we need to rehash some of the overall topics. If you want to prepare some amendments to help strengthen or to guide it in a certain way, do that. And then obviously at the end of that, we'll have an up-down vote on whatever, however it's revised. I think that'll be the most efficient and certainly gives the community an organized way sort of to progress through the evening with us. So that's all I've got.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Skilling, your hand went up, then went down.
No, I mean, I agree with what Councilor Franks is saying. We've had similarly complicated ordinances before, and I think we've actually got more work on this one already done than some of our second readings. So I don't see it as that challenging. I think what we've heard is for sure no investors. We've heard, I think, more support than less for some kind of a home sharing. I think we should start with home sharing, that you've got to have the owner there if you want to rent out your other rooms short-term to other people. That's where I kind of heard consensus, whether you call it an elderly person trying to rent out some rooms, whatever you want to call it. And then if there's amendments that people want to expand that, then it's easier to expand that. But I think if we're going to move it forward, and again, people can vote no on the whole thing and just prohibit it, but if we're going to have a discussion, I think we start with, I've heard a consensus for a home share, owners there all the time. And if folks want to add amendments to that to expand that out, then we can have that discussion. But for staff's sake, I think we should add that. And then my rhetorical question from earlier, I think we can fill in the occupancy blank if that's still blank. And I think for the distancing, if somebody wants to make an amendment and provide some distance, if that's the way they want to go, I think we can do that as well. So I think that covers a lot of the areas that staff was looking for some direction. And as Councilor Frank said, I think there has been discussion tonight. I think there should be some clarity, but I'll check in with Ms. Hodson on that. That is all.
Thank you. All right, Ms. Johnson and then Mr. LeBeer.
I have heard that people are pressing *9 and that they are having difficulty. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. LeBeer?
I generally agree with what Councilor Skilling and Franks have both said. If there's support for it, I think taking a look at adding like duplexes or something to that effect from a staff perspective, from the professionals who know more about that, if there's a way to take a look at adding something like that or have an amendment for something like that, I personally would be supportive of that and hope somebody would support me on that.
And again, I think something like that would come at the second reading with an amendment once we get a final copy, and then you can try to work on that wording. All right, Mr. Beta, then Ms. Gutwein.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to let you know you do have a caller in on that has been trying to get in and has her hand up. I was having some trouble getting in. Caller number 8232.
Yeah, I saw that after we told her to whoever, I'm sorry to say her, the person's pressed *9, but public input's closed on this one, so thank you.
Well, I think you should allow this person in. She's been trying to get in and was having trouble with getting the *9 to work. So
okay.
I think you should relax your rules a little bit to allow this person to be heard.
Thank you for that. Ms. Gutwein?
I would like to see an amendment for duplexes as well. So however that process works.
Okay. All right, any other direction? Okay, Ms. Hodson, are there any questions?
I think we have pretty good direction. Robert, I'm looking at you to see if you feel like, is there anything you need clarified? I think the best way to go forward is to have some options so that they can have those discussions at the next meeting or the next time we address this. Are you clear with that, or is there more you need?
Yes, I believe it's clear, and yeah, I understand the ability to kind of move in two different directions on some of these issues, and we kind of have that menu effect of pick A or B in that particular zone. So I think I've got clarity.
Okay, good. And then we would certainly recommend that City Council take this conversation, especially as complicated as it is, to really have good conversations, additional conversations at your ward meetings or as you interact with your constituents, to make sure that you just are as informed as you possibly can be with what your constituents are interested in doing as it relates to short-term rentals. So in other words, I think we're good there.
Yeah, okay. And I would just also say, because I think folks are going to have some amendments, if there's a way that council can work with staff on some wording and things like that so that we're ready to roll that evening with different amendments and we know what they're going to look like. I think we've all learned from other complicated issues that doing these things on the fly tend to not be the best way, and it always comes down to a couple of our wordsmithing experts who we rely on. So
and it takes a lot of extra time to do that on the fly. So if people can give that some thought, feel free to reach out to the legal staff or to me, and I can direct, or to Robert. We're all more than willing to help so that you feel really prepared when we have our next meeting on this topic.
Ms. Gutwein.
On that note, is this already calendared for the next meeting? Or do we have an idea of when this will happen, just so that we can kind of think about when we want to talk about this at our board meetings?
I don't believe it is calendared for council action, is it? Okay. So no, I have the big master calendar, so it hasn't been calendared yet. So I imagine there's some level of urgency, but we also don't want to, as many of you have said, we don't want to rush this so that the decisions aren't very well thought out, and and the citizens don't feel like they've had enough time to think about it and to give you their thoughts and their feedback. So having said that, we can push this out. We're pretty busy until, we've got pretty full agendas until through May, and then we've got some relief in June and July and into the summer.
Well, I would just say, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, I mean, there is so much interest, I think, to be able to give some good time to have all the interested parties look at what is going to be and to give time for amendments. I think certainly more time is better for this. And, people want to engage. So we'll let you figure that out, Ms. Hodson. Here's a question for council. Ms. Harrison, hand is up.
Thank you. I was just going to suggest if we could, because summers are so hard, if we could maybe look at putting this on the calendar sometime at least after July, either July or later, because we've already had our April meeting. May would be coming up in June, so that would give us potentially 2 meetings to discuss and get input. So if we could, I'm just thinking time-wise, if we could look at the earliest July for our next discussion, that would give us time to be able to get with our constituents. That's all.
Can I respond, Mayor? If we want to go that far out, we can just reserve July 26th. It's a meeting with no agenda topics. That way we would limit that particular meeting to just this topic so that we don't feel crunched with other agenda items. If that's
what do the rest of the council feel about that time frame? I think that's a good time frame.
Sure. I think it might also depend on this next conversation that we're going to have either tonight or maybe postpone, depending, if we're going to put things on the ballot, that's starting to get right into the time when we'd have to start having conversations about things that would go on the ballot as well, to be ready to go. So I think July would be great. I think maybe if this next conversation that takes place starts to load up and we go back from the days, say we are going to put things on the ballot and we have to use that July 26th, that's going to be probably a pretty big type of an evening. So
yeah, and that may not give us enough time to get on the ballot.
Yep.
That's a good point.
So, okay, well, we can work from there on that. The next item is the presentation on November ballot question options. Does council want to dig into this? And the reason why I'm asking is even through the Budget and Audit Committee, there's a lot here for those that have attended. So do you want to plow forward with this conversation? If not, what would be a date that we could carry this conversation forward? So Ms. Hodson, is there if the council were to say we're going to, even if we started it and didn't finish, or we said we're going to wait, what would that look like?
When would we reschedule this for? Is that what you're asking? We'll have to do a little horse trading with Mr. Smith, but I think we could do May 3rd. The next 2 April meetings are just really packed.
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Skilling, your hand is up.
It's almost 10 o'clock. We're about to talk about Tabor and marijuana and taxes and fun stuff. So my vote would be to postpone, unless there's some other reason that it has to be done tonight.
So no voting, just consensus. And Mr. Chair.
Metaphorical vote.
Yes. Mr. Chair of the Budget and Audit, do you have any thoughts on that, Mr. Beta?
I'm not aware of any compelling reason why this couldn't be set over.
Any other council members want to weigh in on trying to tackle cigarette taxes and marijuana and other things related to Tabor. Ms. Franks?
I say at this hour, and it's already been a pretty weighty evening so far, I would say May would be fine to postpone.
Ms. Gutwein, same. Okay, it doesn't look like there's any objections to that.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. I'll try, like I said, we'll do a little bit of rescheduling here, and we'll try to keep the May 3rd study session open to allow for time to have a pretty thorough conversation. This is another one that will probably be of a high interest to our citizens.
Yeah. And forgive me, just as preparation, is the budget and audit meeting, is that video posted?
Bruce, do you know the answer to that?
Sir, I do not. I do not know. I can find out though and make it happen if it's not.
And we'll post that. We'll send out. We'll push that out to you. We'll get the answer to that and then push it out to all of council in advance of this meeting, so that for the folks who weren't able to attend, we can all be caught up. That's a really good idea.
Yeah, because there was a lot there, and there was a lot of input from our resident board members that I think would be helpful for the body of the whole to understand. And that way the chair doesn't have to try to remember all of those recommendations that were put forth, or as far as what the committee thought. So, okay, cool. Well, I know that you have your whole finance team on. I know our CFO was on and her whole team. So thank you, Ms. Bjorklund, and everyone for hanging with us tonight. And sorry to not get to you, but hopefully we'll get you some time back. Okay, with that, are there any council committee reports that anybody has for city council committees? Mr. Abel?
Yes, on April 15th, I believe it is, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Rome, but the Campaign Finance Committee will meet. We have some suggestions that we've approved by consensus in committee. We'll be reviewing those to make sure we have them as concisely as possible and send them along to be codified by our attorney, Mr. Gruskin, I believe. We also are going to, though, deal with one other question, and that is whether it would be acceptable as a campaign finance write-off for folks to be reimbursed from their campaign fund for child care or dependent adult care that has to be secured in order for the candidate to go campaign. If there are children to be taken care of, and it's a campaign meeting that the candidate needs to attend, then it very well could be a campaign expense. That's what we will be looking at. It would be the same for a disabled or an adult that needs care as well, and the candidate is the caregiver for that person. So we'll be looking at that question and clarifying the things we've already addressed by consensus. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Gutwein?
Thank you, Mayor. We will have our legislative committee meeting this Wednesday at 9 a.m.
Great. All right. Metro Mayor's Caucus, we've been engaged in Senate Bill 62 pretty heavily, actually, something that the mayors don't tend to engage in, and that's the jail population bill. And so the caucus is working on a position, and had started out with trying to work with them and see if we could get it amended. And I imagine we'll probably go to an opposed position. CML is also in an opposed position, which they were previously opposed, and they've moved around a little bit. But I think concerns are continuing to grow. And I think for me personally, I think it'd be best if maybe we could just sit down with everyone and work some stuff out. Also of note is the school resource officer bill, if you've heard of that, and kind of what that would do with our school resource officers, and certainly a lot of concern in the community with those two bills. And then the last one is the one that I always talk about, and that's transportation, and trying to find some more dollars to spread out. It will be interesting to see, though, with potential relief package, as well as if there is truly an infrastructure package that will come through, we could get some serious dollars for the state of Colorado. So those are my committee reports. Ms. Springsteen, do you have a city committee report?
Well, apparently we're not just doing city committees, because Metro Mayor Caucus is not a city committee. And so I just wanted to report
It actually is a city.
21-1251 has been submitted to the General Assembly by Representatives Herod and Caraveo regarding restricting the use of ketamine and chemical restraints. It was just submitted to the General Assembly last week. Thank you.
And just to clarify, that's not a bill that the city's taken a position on, so that's something that Ms. Springsteen's interested in her spare time.
And neither are the Metro Mayor's Caucus things that you are.
Are there any other comments or questions tonight? Okay. Mr. Beta, your hand is up.
Yes, thank you. I just want to remind everyone that the Colorado Food Bank for the Rockies will have a drive-up distribution tomorrow at Phillips United Methodist Church in Ward 3, located at Pierce and Florida. Again, the drive-up starts at 3. So if anyone has any families that are in need that they know of, please pass the word that they can drive up, and they will be very well rewarded. Also, if there's anybody that would be willing to help out, they always need hands to help load and sort the food in the boxes and so forth. So if you're willing to help, that starts about 1 o'clock. The truck gets there about 1 o'clock, and then we start the assembly and so forth at that time. That's all. Thank you.
Mr. LeBeer?
Yeah, I just want to mention, I don't know if you've all gotten emails on this or not, so I just thought I should mention it in case you haven't. Dr. Cog is having their annual award celebration. Last year it was canceled because of COVID, but they are having it online this year as a virtual event. It's going to be April 28th, and it's going to be in the late morning, early afternoon at 11:30 a.m. And they'll be talking about accomplishments and things that happened with Dr. Cog over the past year. If you have any interest, if you haven't got an email on it, let me know. Happy to send the info over to you. Thanks.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that exhausts our committee. Do we have any development dialogue? Did you meet? Or has it been pretty quiet?
We did not. Well, I wouldn't say everything's been quiet. It's just there's no, we're still in the scheduling. I need to schedule the next meeting. The topic now is the next couple of meetings likely will be inclusionary zoning, which is a pretty big lift for staff. So I will get with them, and I need to get the next meeting scheduled, but we also have to make it productive. A lot of it is going to be comparative with other cities. So there's going to have to be a presentation to the committee about what other cities are doing with inclusionary zoning, because we're not going to reinvent the wheel. And I know staff has been pretty inundated, whether it's with the STR stuff, with development dialogues, other projects that we're actually going to have before this body 2 weeks from tonight for part 2 of the district's conversation. So yes, we will get that scheduled soon, but that is, again, another major lift, and I am being respectful of everybody's time. But soon, coming soon.
Right. And there might be some legislation also that might intertwine. So, cool. All right. Well, I appreciate everybody's time this evening and appreciate those updates, and we will see you next week. Again, think we have a pretty busy Monday night next week. So if you could try to get your questions in by Friday, would be super beneficial. I know there were some comments about things not getting back until 5 p.m. at our last meeting. However, a lot of those questions didn't get submitted until later in the day on Monday. So be really helpful. That's why we try to get those packets out 10 days early, so we have plenty of time. So thank you all very much, and we will adjourn at 10:03 p.m.